The water was impossibly still that night. Ellie Chambers stood at the edge of the shore, bare toes sinking into wet sand, as wavelets lapped gently around her ankles. Behind her, the dense pine forest of Maplewood Park loomed like a wall of darkness, but she didn't turn to look. Her eyes remained fixed on the lake's glassy surface, reflecting a nearly full moon that hung low in the night sky. "I can hear you," she whispered. No wind disturbed the trees, no birds called. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Next to her, Marcus Holt shifted uneasily. "We shouldn't be here, Ellie. This doesn't feel right." On her other side, Danny Reeves said nothing, but her hand found Ellie's and squeezed tight. The three 17-year-olds had been inseparable since kindergarten, the kind of friendship that everyone in town spoke about with a mixture of admiration and envy. They finished each other's sentences. They knew each other's secrets, or at least they thought they did. "You don't have to stay," Ellie said, her voice oddly flat. "But I need to know." "Know what?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly. "You haven't told us anything. You just dragged us out of bed in the middle of the night and said we had to come to the lake. What are we even doing here?" Ellie didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her words sent a chill down her friends' spines. "Don't you remember? We were here before. All three of us. We were 8 years old, and something happened that summer. Something we promised never to talk about." Danny shook her head firmly. "That's impossible. We would remember. Would we?" Ellie turned to look at her friends for the first time since they'd arrived at the shore. Her eyes seemed darker somehow, deeper, as if something else was looking out through them. "I've been having dreams every night for weeks now, and in the dreams, it shows me things. Things we did, things we saw, things we buried." Marcus took a step back. "Who shows you? What are you talking about?" A strange smile spread across Ellie's face. "It's coming now. Can't you feel it? The water's waking up." The lake's surface remained perfectly smooth, but the air around them seemed to thicken, pressing against their skin like an invisible fog. And then they heard it. A sound that wasn't quite a voice, wasn't quite It rose from the depths of the water, calling their names in a language they shouldn't have understood but somehow did. "We need to leave, right now." Marcus grabbed both girls by their arms, but Ellie pulled away. "Don't you want to remember?" she asked, her voice now barely recognizable. "It says if we don't remember, it will happen again, just like before." "What will happen again?" Danny asked, tears streaming down her face now. "Ellie, you're scaring me." But Ellie had already turned back to the water. She took one step forward, then another. The lake rose to her knees, her waist, her chest. "Ellie, stop!" Marcus shouted, splashing in after her. Danny followed a heartbeat later. None of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line, clutching a small book to its chest, frantically scribbling words onto its pages. By morning, all three teenagers had vanished completely. The only evidence they had ever been at the lake were their shoes, neatly arranged in a row at the water's edge, and 3 sets of footprints leading into the water. Footprints that stopped abruptly, as if they had simply ceased to exist halfway to the center of the lake. The search lasted for weeks. The entire town of Maplewood mobilized to find the missing teens. Divers explored the lake but found nothing. Search parties combed the surrounding forests, but discovered only a strange set of symbols carved into the trunk of an ancient oak tree. Symbols that no one could identify or translate. The search expanded to neighboring towns, then to neighboring state. Missing person posters plastered every storefront in Maplewood, but as summer turned to fall, and fall to winter, hope faded. The 3 sets of shoes remained in the police evidence room, untouched and unclaimed. 3 devastated families were left with no answers, no closure, just empty bedrooms, and the unbearable weight of not knowing. The investigation went cold. Life in Maplewood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the town carried its grief like a shadow. People spoke in hushed tones about the missing teens, and parents kept their children away from the lake after dark. As the years passed, the disappearance of Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, Danny Reeves became a local legend, a cautionary tale, and eventually, a distant memory. Until now. Part 1. Ripples. Chapter 1. Maplewood. Present day, March 16. The rain beat a steady rhythm against the roof of Noah Clark's car. As he drove past the faded "Welcome to Maplewood" sign, the wipers squeaked across the windshield. Struggling to keep up with the downpour, he squinted through the blur, trying to match the town before him with the distant memories from his childhood. 16 years had passed since he'd last set foot in Maplewood. He'd been 11 when his family moved away, old enough to remember the place, but young enough that those memories had softened into something dreamlike and unreliable. The town seemed smaller now, shrunk by time and perspective. "You sure about this?" His sister's voice came through the phone's speaker, tinny but concerned. "It's not too late to turn around." Noah adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. "I already signed the lease, Beth. Besides, a change of scenery might be exactly what I need." A change of scenery is a vacation in Maui, not moving to the middle of nowhere to write a book about 3 kids who disappeared before you were even born. "I was born. I was 5 when it happened. You know what I mean. It's morbid, no? And after what you've been through this year, I'm fine." He cut her off. "The divorce was finalized months ago. I've processed it." The silence on the other end told him Beth wasn't convinced. "Look," he softened his tone, "this book could be my big break. People are fascinated by cold cases, and the Maplewood disappearances have everything: small town secrets, unexplained phenomena, 3 teenagers who vanished without a trace. No one's ever written a definitive account of what happened. Maybe because no one knows what happened." Beth replied. "You realize you could end up with the exact same writer's block you had in the city, just with fewer food delivery options." Noah couldn't help but smile. His sister knew him too well. "I'll keep you posted, and I promise to call if things get weird." Define weird. "If I start hearing voices from the lake or carving mysterious symbols into trees, you'll be the first to know." "Not funny," Beth said, but he could hear the reluctant amusement in her voice. "Call me when you get settled. Love you. Love you too." Noah ended the call and focused on navigating the unfamiliar streets. According to his GPS, the rental cabin was just on the outskirts of town, close enough to access amenities but isolated enough to provide the quiet he needed for writing. The realtor had described it as rustic and charming, words that usually translated to outdated and small, but the photos had shown a decent-sized space, with large windows overlooking the lake. The lake, Maplewood Lake, the site of the disappearance. Noah hadn't planned it that way initially. When he'd first pitched the true crime book to his agent, he'd envisioned researching from his apartment in Chicago. But as he dug deeper into the case, he'd realized that understanding what happened to Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt and Danny Reeves would require more than just news archives and police reports. He needed to immerse himself in the town, talk to the people who remembered them, breathe the same. The GPS directed him to turn onto a narrow road that curved around the eastern shore of the lake. Through the rain-streaked window, Noah caught glimpses of dark water stretching out beyond a fringe of pine trees. Even in the dreary weather, there was something undeniably beautiful about the landscape: wild, untamed, and slightly menacing in its vastness. The road began to climb, winding up a gentle slope until it reached a clearing where a single cabin stood. Noah pulled into the gravel driveway and cut the engine, taking a moment to study his new home for the next 6 months. The cabin was larger than he'd expected, with a wide covered porch and walls of rich dark wood that had weathered gracefully. Rain cascaded from the eaves in silvery curtain. Beyond the cabin, the ground sloped down toward the lake, which was barely visible through the trees and rain. Noah grabbed his laptop bag and made a dash for the porch, fumbling with the keys the realtor had mailed him. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a spacious interior that smelled of pine and wood smoke. He flipped on the lights, relieved to find that the electricity was already connected as promised. The main room combined a living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A hallway presumably led to the bedrooms and bathroom. Large windows lined the wall facing the lake, though the view was currently obscured by rain and encroaching darkness. Noah set his laptop on the kitchen counter and returned to the car for the rest of his belongings. By the time he'd brought in his suitcases and the boxes of research materials, he was soaked through and shivering slightly. After a quick exploration of the cabin, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, all basic but clean and functional, he changed into dry clothes and set about making the place habitable. The kitchen was stocked with a few essentials as the realtor had promised, enough for him to make a simple dip. He'd need to drive into town tomorrow for a proper grocery run. With a mug of instant coffee in hand, Noah unpacked the most important box. His research on the Maplewood disappearance. He spread the materials across the dining table. Newspaper clippings, photocopies of police reports, printouts of interviews, and a detailed timeline he'd constructed of the events leading up to that night in. 3 smiling faces looked up at him from a yellowed newspaper photo. Ellie with her long dark hair and serious eyes, Marcus with his confident grin, and Danny with her signature freckles. They stood with arms linked, carefree and unaware of what awaited them just months later. Noah had spent countless hours researching these 3 teenagers, to the point where he felt like he knew them. But being here in the same town where they had lived and disappeared, gave their story a weight it hadn't possessed before. These weren't just case files anymore. They were real people who had walked these streets, swam in that lake, and then vanished without explanation. A crack of thunder made him jump, sloshing coffee onto the table. Noah scrambled to move his papers before they could be damaged, cursing under his. As he mopped up the spill with a kitchen towel, the lights flickered once, twice, and then steadied. Great, he muttered. Just what he needed. Unreliable electricity in the middle of nowhere. He should have asked more questions about the power situation before signing the lease. A sharp rapping sound cut through his thoughts. Noah froze, dish towel in hand. Was someone at the door? Who would be visiting in this weather? Especially when the cabin had been vacant until today. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Noah hesitated, then moved cautiously toward the front door. Through the small window, he could make out a figure standing on the porch. Someone in a dark raincoat with the hood pulled up. He unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "Hello, Mr. Clark?" The figure pushed back its hood, revealing a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob. "I'm Sheriff Helen Reeves. Hope I didn't startle you." Sheriff Reeves? Noah opened the door wider, recognition dawning. As in Danny's aunt, she confirmed, her expression neutral. "May I come in? I promise not to drip too much on your floors." Noah stepped aside, mind racing. Helen Reeves had been mentioned in his research. A junior deputy when her niece disappeared, later elected sheriff. He hadn't planned on approaching her until he'd settled in, prepared his questions and figured out the most sensitive way to broach the subject of her missing niece. Sheriff Reeves shrugged off her raincoat and hung it carefully on the hook by the door. Underneath, she wore the tan uniform of the Maplewood Sheriff's Department, complete with badge and gun. Despite her age, she stood straight-backed and alert, her blue eyes sharp and assessing as they took in both Noah and the cabin. "Not much has changed in here," she remarked. "Used to belong to the Fosters before they moved to Arizona. County maintains it as a rental property now." Noah cleared his throat. "Can I offer you coffee, Sheriff? It's just instant, I'm afraid." "No thanks." She turned her full attention to him now. "Word travels fast in Maplewood, Mr. Especially when someone rents the old Foster place and tells the realtor they're writing a book about the '94 disappearances." Noah winced. He should have anticipated this. "I was planning to reach out to you properly once I'd settled in. I understand this is a sensitive topic, especially for— Let's cut to the chase," she said, crossing her arms. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish here?" "I'm a true crime writer," Noah explained, gesturing toward the research spread across the table. "I want to tell the full story of what happened to Ellie, Marcus and Dan. The existing coverage is fragmented, sensationalized in parts and oversimplified in others. I believe they deserve a thoughtful, comprehensive account." Sheriff Reeves' expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "And what makes you think you can solve a case that stumped law enforcement for nearly 30 years? I'm not claiming I can solve it. My goal is to document it thoroughly, bring attention back to the case, maybe generate new leads or witnesses." The sheriff moved to the table, examining his research materials with a professional eye. She picked up a newspaper clipping, studied it briefly, then set it down with careful precision. "You've done your homework. I've tried, but there's only so much you can learn from archives and databases. That's why I'm here, to talk to the people who knew them, who remember what happened." Sheriff Reeves turned back to him. "People in this town have spent decades trying to forget Mr. Clark. Some wounds never fully heal. I understand that," Noah said, meeting her gaze, "and I have no intention of causing additional pain. But don't the families deserve answers? Don't Ellie, Marcus, and Danny deserve to have their story told properly?" A long silence stretched between them. Noah could hear the rain beating against the roof, the distant rumble of thunder moving across the lake. Finally, Sheriff Reeves spoke. I assume you know about the journal. Noah blinked in surprise. Ellie's journal? The one found by a fisherman years later? Yes, it was mentioned in several news reports, though the contents were never fully disclosed. Because there were hardly any contents to disclose, most pages were destroyed by water damage, and what little remained, she trailed off, her expression distant for a moment before refocusing. Let's just say it raised more questions than it answered. I'd very much like to see it if that's possible. The sheriff's mouth corked in what might have been a smile. I figured you would. That's partly why I'm here. She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small business card, which she placed on the table atop his research. My office hours are 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Come by tomorrow and we can discuss what I'm willing to share and what's off limits. Noah picked up the card. Thank you, Sheriff. I appreciate this more than you know. Don't thank me yet. She moved toward the door and retrieved her raincoat. One more thing, Mr. Clark. The lake can be dangerous, especially during storm season. The currents are unpredictable, and the weather can change in minutes. I strongly advise staying away from the shore after dark. Noah wondered if she gave this warning to all newcomers, or if it was specifically for him. I'll keep that in mind. Sheriff Reeves nodded, pulled up her hood and stepped back onto the porch. Before Noah could close the door, she turned back to him. One last question. Why this case? Out of all the unsolved mysteries out there, why Maplewood? Noah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I've always been drawn to, even as a kid after my family moved away. I kept clippings about the case. There's something about it that feels unfinished. Everything about it is unfinished, she replied quietly. That's the problem. She studied him for a moment longer, as if trying to read something in his face. Lock your doors tonight, Mr. Clark. Storm's getting worse. With that, she disappeared into the rain, leaving Noah standing in the doorway, with more questions than he'd had before her arrival. He closed and locked the door, then returned to the table where his research materials waited. The sheriff's visit had been unexpected, but potentially valuable. She hadn't shut him down completely, which was more than he'd hoped for on his first day in town. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows while wind moaned through the tree. Noah glanced toward the dark expanse of glass, suddenly aware of how isolated the cabin was. Through gaps in the curtains, he could see nothing but his own reflection superimposed over impenetrable blackness. For a brief, disorienting moment, he had the sensation that someone was looking back at him from the darkness beyond the glass, watching, waiting, remembering. Noah shook himself and drew the curtains close. It was just first night jitters, combined with the sheriff's ominous warning, and the storm's eerie ambience. Tomorrow in daylight, everything would look different. He would go into town, stock up on supplies, visit the sheriff's office, and properly begin his investigation. He gathered his research materials and moved them to the second bedroom, which he planned to use as an office. As he arranged the papers on the small desk, a particular photograph caught his attention, a close-up of the strange symbols found carved into an oak tree after the teen's disappearance. The symbols had never been definitively identified, though theories ranged from Native American pictographs to teenage graffiti to occult markings. Noah traced the whorls and lines with his fingertip. There was something oddly familiar about them, though he couldn't place what. Perhaps he'd seen similar symbols in other cases he'd researched. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Noah fumbled for his phone, activating the flashlight function. The beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the walls. He moved carefully back to the kitchen, searching the drawers until he found a flashlight and some candles. As he set about lighting them, he tried to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping up his spine. It was just a power outage during a storm, perfectly normal. Nothing to do with his research, or the sheriff's warning, or the 3 teenagers who had vanished within sight of this very lake. Still, Noah found himself double-checking that all the doors and windows were securely locked before settling on the couch with a blanket and his phone. The rain continued to drum against the roof, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious. Occasionally, gusts of wind would shake the cabin, making the timbers creak and groan like something alive. Despite his exhaustion from the long drive, sleep eluded him. His mind kept returning to the 3 missing teenagers, imagining them standing at the shore on that summer night. What had they seen? What had they heard? What had drawn them into the water? Around 2 a.m., Noah realized he was straining to hear something beneath the storm's chaos. A sound that wasn't quite a voice, wasn't quite a song. Just as he was drifting off, he could have sworn he heard his name being called from somewhere distant, somewhere cold and dark and wet. But that was impossible. It was just the wind, just the rain, just his imagination primed by ghost stories and true crime research, and the uncanny silence of a town asleep under the storm. Noah turned on his side, pulled the blanket higher, and told himself that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow in the light, he would begin to unravel the mystery that had brought him to Maplewood. He didn't dream that night, or if he did, he mercifully couldn't remember it in the morning. March 17 morning arrived with surprising brightness. As if the previous night's storm had been a collective hallucination, Noah woke on the couch, stiff and disoriented, to find sunlight streaming through gaps in the curtain. The power had returned sometime during the night, as evidenced by the blinking clock on the microwave. He stretched, wincing at the crick in his neck, and moved to the window. Pulling aside the curtain, he was greeted by a view that justified all the charming and picturesque descriptions in the rental listing. The cabin sat on a small rise, with the ground sloping gently down through a stretch of pine forest to the shore of Maplewood Lake. The water sparkled in the morning sun, a vast blue expanse rimmed by dense forest and distant hills. It was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the ominous atmosphere of the previous night, or with the tragic events that had occurred here nearly 30 years ago. But Noah knew that beautiful places could harbor dark secrets. His years as a true crime writer had taught him that much. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Noah made a list of errands for the day. Grocery shopping, a stop at the sheriff's office, and perhaps some initial conversations with locals if the opportunity presented itself. He also needed to find a coffee shop or cafe with reliable Wi-Fi, as the cabin's internet connection was spotty at best. The drive into town was far more pleasant by daylight. Maplewood proper was centered around a main street lined with brick buildings, most dating from the early. It had the quaint, slightly worn charm of many small Midwestern towns that had seen better economic days, but still retained their core identity. Noah parked near a grocery store called Foster's Market, wondering if it was related to the family who had once owned his rental cabin. The store was modestly sized but well stocked, with an unexpectedly extensive produce section. As he navigated the aisles filling his cart with essentials, he became aware of curious glances from other shoppers. At the checkout, the cashier, a woman in her 60s with a name tag reading Joyce, studied him with undisguised interest. "You must be the writer staying at the old Foster place," she said as she scanned his items. Noah shouldn't have been surprised. Sheriff Reeves had warned him that word traveled fast in Maplewood. "That's right, Noah Clark. Just moved in yesterday. Quite a welcome you got with that storm. Knocked out power all over the east side of town." Joyce bagged his groceries with practiced efficiency. "You picked an interesting time to visit Maplewood. How so?" "It's almost the anniversary of those poor kids going missing, I mean. That's what you're writing about, isn't it?" Noah nodded, seizing the opportunity. "Did you know them? Ellie, Marcus, and Danny?" Joyce's hand stilled momentarily. Everyone knew everyone back then. Smaller town than it is now. Ellie used to come in here with her mother every Saturday morning. Always polite, that girl. Quiet, though. All three of them were good kids. That's what made it so hard to understand. Why they'd go out to the lake in the middle of the night like that. It wasn't like them to be reckless. Joyce resumed bagging groceries. "Your total is set." Noah paid, then hesitated before gathering his bag. "I'd love to hear more about what the town was like back then, if you wouldn't mind talking sometime." Joyce regarded him thoughtfully. "I get off at 4. There's a coffee shop down the street. Lakeside Brew. Good place to talk. I'll be there." "Thank you, Joyce." With his groceries stowed in the car, Noah decided to walk to the sheriff's office, which was only a few blocks away. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, carrying the mingled scents of pine from the surrounding forests, and something sweet from a nearby bakery. The Maplewood Sheriff's Department occupied a sturdy brick building with American and state flags fluttering out front. Inside, a deputy at the front desk looked up as Noah entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Sheriff Reeves. She's expecting me." "Noah Clark." The deputy nodded and picked up a phone. After a brief conversation, he gestured toward a hallway. Second door on the right. Noah found Sheriff Reeves in a modest office. walls lined with filing cabinets and a window overlooking the town square. She was typing at a computer but looked up at his knock. Mr. Clark. Right on time. She gestured to a chair across from her desk. Close the door, please. Noah complied and took a seat, setting his notebook on his lap. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, Sheriff. I know this can't be easy. Sheriff Reeves leaned back in her chair, studying him with the same piercing gaze as the previous night. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. I'm willing to share certain information about the case, because I believe after all this time, that fresh eyes might see something we missed. But there are boundaries. Of course, I completely understand. Do you? She raised an eyebrow. Because here's what I won't discuss. The impact on my sister's family. Private details about Danny's life that aren't relevant to the investigation, or any aspects of the case that were withheld from public record for good reason. Noah nodded. That's more than fair. My interest is in understanding what happened, not sensationalizing personal tragedy. Sheriff Reeves seemed satisfied with his response. She opened a drawer and removed a manila folder, which she placed on the desk between them. This is a copy of the initial police report, along with photographs from the scene and witness statements collected in the days after the disappearance. I'm trusting you to use this responsibly. Noah reached for the folder with carefully concealed eagerness. This was a major breakthrough. Access to primary documents that would give him insights beyond what newspaper accounts could provide. Thank you, this is incredibly helpful. It's not the whole file, Sheriff Reeves cautioned. Just what I'm comfortable sharing at this stage. Depending on how things go, I may allow you to see more later. Noah opened the folder, quickly scanning its content. The police report was more detailed than he'd expected, with meticulous notes about the positioning of the 3 pairs of shoes found at the shoreline, the direction and depth of the footprints leading into the water, and the weather conditions on the night of. It says here that the footprints stopped abruptly about 15 feet from shore. Noah noted, as if they'd vanished into thin air. Sheriff Reeves finished for him. That was one of many unexplained aspects of the case. The lake bottom at that point drops off sharp. If they'd gone any further, they would have been in water over their heads. But there were no signs of struggle. No indication they had swum or been dragged from that point. Noah continued reading, and none of the families reported any concerning behavior in the days leading up to the disappearance. A slight hesitation before Sheriff Reeves answered. Nothing significant at the time. In hindsight, there were some oddities. Ellie had been having trouble sleep. Marcus had become increasingly interested in local folklore about the lake. Danny, she trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. Danny, what? Noah prompted gently. She'd started keeping a journal. My sister found it after she disappeared, but it contained nothing useful. Just typical teenage thoughts and concerns. Sheriff Reeves' tone made it clear this was one of the personal details she preferred not to elaborate on. Noah respectfully moved. The report mentions symbols found carved into a tree near the lake. Do you have photographs of those? Sheriff Reeves reached for the folder and flipped through until she found a black and white photograph. She slid it across the desk. The image showed the trunk of a massive oak tree with a series of symbols carved deep into the bark. They formed no pattern that Noah could immediately recognize. Curved lines intersecting with straight ones, circles with dots at their centers, shapes that resembled stylized waves or eyes. Were these ever identified, translated? Sheriff Reeves shook her head. We consulted linguists, anthropologists, even a cryptologist from the state university. No one could definitively say what they meant or who created them. The tree was old, at least a century, but the carvings appeared to be fresh at the time of the disappearance. And did the 3 teenagers have any known interest in symbology or secret codes? Not that we could establish. None of their school materials or personal belongings contained similar markings. Sheriff Reeves tapped the photograph. The prevailing theory was that the symbols were unrelated to the disappearance, perhaps created by other local teens or hikers. Noah wasn't but they were fresh carvings, found immediately after 3 teenagers vanished mysteriously. That's quite a coincidence. In a case with so many loose ends, Mr. Clark, coincidences are all we have. Sheriff Reeves gathered the papers back into the fold. Now about Ellie's journal, the one found by the fisherman years later. Noah leaned forward eagerly. Yes, I'd very much like to see it. I'm afraid that won't be possible. The journal is considered evidence in an ongoing investigation, but I can tell you what little we learned from it. She folded her hands on the desk, As I mentioned, most pages were destroyed by water damage. The journal itself was waterlogged. The ink blurred or washed away completely on all but a few pages. The most intact entry was dated June 10, 1994, a week before the disappearance. What did it say? Sheriff Reeves recited from memory. It's getting closer each night. At first it just watched from the water. Now I hear it outside my window. It doesn't want to hurt us. It says it needs us to remember what happened that summer when we were 8. But I don't remember anything from that summer. None of us do. Why can't we remember? A chill ran down Noah's spine despite the warmth of the office. And you verified this was Ellie's handwriting. Another hesitation. That's where it gets complicated. When we compared the writing to known samples of Ellie's handwriting from school assignments and letters, there were discrepancies, enough that we couldn't conclusively state she wrote the journal entry. Could it have been a forgery, or perhaps written by one of the other missing team? We considered both possibilities. The handwriting didn't match Marcus or Danny either. And as for forgery, who would forge a journal entry only to throw it in the lake where it might never be found? Sheriff Reeves shook her head. The more likely explanation is that the water damage altered the appearance of the writing. Noah made notes, mind racing with possibilities. The entry mentions something that happened when they were 8 years old. That would have... Was there anything significant that occurred that summer? Anything involving the three of them? Not that we could determine. They were just ordinary kids, having an ordinary summer as far as anyone could recall. Sheriff Reeves glanced at her watch. I'm afraid I have another appointment in 5 minutes, Mr. Clark. Noah reluctantly closed his notebook. Of course, thank you for your time and for sharing these materials. Would it be possible for me to take the folder to review more thoroughly? You can review it here in the station, but it doesn't leave the building. Come back anytime during office hours, and Deputy Collins at the front desk will set you up in a room. Sheriff Reeves stood, signaling the end of their meeting. One more thing. If your research uncovers anything at all that might be relevant to the investigation, I expect you to bring it to me immediately. Absolutely. Noah assured her, rising as well. Actually, I do have one last question before I go. The report mentioned that searches continued for weeks after the disappearance, but eventually had to be scaled back. Were there any other significant findings during that period? Anything that didn't make it into this initial report? Sheriff Reeves studied him for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. There was one thing. About 3 weeks after they disappeared, a child's swimming suit washed up on the far shore of the lake. It was faded, old, estimated to be at least a decade old at that time. We were never able to determine who it belonged to, and no family in the area reported it missing. It may have been unrelated, but the timing was notable. A child's swimsuit from around 1985. Noah repeated slowly. The same summer Ellie referred to in her journal. A coincidence? Most likely, Sheriff Reeves said, but her tone lacked conviction. Now, if you'll excuse me. Noah thanked her again and left the office, his mind buzzing with new information and questions. The symbols on the tree, the mysterious journal entry with its questionable handwriting, the reference to a forgotten summer, the old swimsuit pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer. Outside the sheriff's department, Noah checked his watch. He had several hours before his meeting with Joyce at the coffee shop. Deciding to make the most of his time, he walked down Main Street, taking in the sights of Maplewood in daylight. The town had the comfortable familiarity of many small Midwestern communities, a mix of well-maintained historic buildings and more modern storefronts, American flags hanging from lampposts, benches placed strategically along the sidewalks. He could imagine Ellie, Marcus, and Danny walking these same streets, perhaps stopping at the corner drugstore or meeting friends at what was now a pizzeria but, according to his research, had been an ice cream parlor in the... Noah's attention was caught by a modest storefront with a sign reading Maplewood Historical Society and Museum. Perfect. Local historical societies often contained archives and exhibits that could provide context for his research. He climbed the short steps and pushed open the door, setting off a small bell. The interior was dimly lit and smelled of old books and furniture polish. Glass display cases lined the walls, containing artifacts from the town's past, farming implements, vintage photographs, clothing and household items from various eras. A gray-haired man looked up from a desk near the back of the room. "Good morning," he called, setting aside a magnifying glass. "Welcome to the Maplewood Historical Society. Just browsing or looking for something specific?" Noah approached, extending his hand. Noah Clark, I'm new in town doing research for a book. The man's grip was surprisingly firm as he shook Noah's hand. Walter Fisher, museum curator and town historian. What sort of book are you writing, Mr. Clark? Noah hesitated, unsure how the curator would react to his interest in the town's darkest chapter. It's about the 1994 disappearances. Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, and Danny Reeves. Walter's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. That case still haunts this town, you know. Not just because we never found them, but because of what came after. What came after? Noah asked, pulse quickening. Walter gestured to a pair of chairs in a small reading nook. Let's sit. My old knees can't handle standing too long these days. Once they were settled, Walter continued, the disappearance changed Maplewood. Before, it was the kind of place where nobody locked their doors at night. Kids played outside until dark without parents worrying. After those three vanished, he shook his head. Fear crept in. Suspicion. For a while, neighbors eyed each other, wondering if someone among them knew more than they were saying. Were there suspects? Noah asked, pulling out his notebook. Officially, no, but unofficially, plenty of theories circulated. Some thought it might have been Otto Krebs, the old hermit who lived on the far side of the lake. Others suspected a drifter passing through town. A few of the more paranoid sorts even pointed fingers at Marcus's father, James Holt, though there was never a shred of evidence against him. Noah made notes. What about Otto Krebs? Was he ever investigated? Oh, thoroughly. Sheriff's department searched his cabin, questioned him multiple times, never found anything connecting him to the kids. He was odd, sure. Lived alone, rarely came to town. Preferred the company of books to people, but being eccentric isn't a crime. Is he still around? I'd like to talk to him. Walter shook his head. Died about 10 years ago. Heart attack, they said. Cabin's abandoned now. County owns it, but hasn't done anything with the property. Noah felt a pang of disappointment. One potential witness lost. What about James Holt, Marcus's father? Moved away a year after Marcus disappeared. The rumors took their toll. I expect, last I heard, he was living somewhere in Oregon. Walter leaned back in his chair, studying Noah. Why this case, Mr. Clark? What drew you to a 30-year-old mystery in a town you have no connection to? It was the same question Sheriff Reeves had asked. Noah considered giving the same non-committal answer, but something about Walter's direct gaze encouraged honesty. I do have a connection, actually, Noah admitted. I lived here as a child. My family moved away when I was 11. But I remember when it happened. The whole town was in shock. Walter's eyebrows rose. Clark, I don't recall a Clark family from that era. We weren't here long, less than 2 years. My father worked for the lumber company that closed down in '99. We left before that, though, in '98. That explains it. And you carried the memory of this tragedy with you all these years. Noah nodded slowly. I was fascinated by it even then. 3 teenagers vanishing without a trace. The mysterious symbols, the footprints that just stopped. It was like something out of a novel. As I got older and became a writer, I kept thinking I should come back someday, try to understand what really happened. Walter seemed to accept this explanation. Well, our archives might have materials that could help your research. Newspaper coverage, town council minutes from that period, oral histories from residents. You're welcome to explore them. That would be extremely helpful, thank you, Noah said. Genuine excitement in his voice. Is there a particular focus I should start with? Walter thought for a moment. If you're interested in the context around the disappearance, you might want to look into the town's history with the lake. Maplewood Lake has always had a complex relationship with the community. How so? It's provided livelihood, fishing, tourism, but it's also taken lives over the years. Drownings, boating accidents, even a few suspicious deaths that were never fully explained. Walter's voice lowered slightly. Some of the old-timers say the lake has moods, that it remembers. Noah felt a chill despite the warmth of the small museum. Remembers what? That's the question, isn't it? Walter stood, ending the conversation. Come, I'll show you to the archives. They're in the basement, not the most comfortable space, I'm afraid, but everything is organized chronologically. Materials from the 90s will be in the 3rd row of filing cabinets. Noah followed the curator through a door behind the main desk. and down a narrow staircase. The basement was surprisingly large, with floor-to-ceiling shelves and filing cabinets arranged in neat rows. A couple of reading tables with desktop lamps provided small islands of light in the otherwise dim space. "Feel free to make copies of anything non-fragile," Walter said, gesturing to an old photocopier in the corner. "Just 50 cents per page. Honor system. The jar's right next to." He pointed toward a section of filing cabinets. 1990s are there. As I mentioned, town newspapers, council records, personal accounts, donated by residents. "I'll leave you to it." "Thank you," Noah said, already moving toward the cabinets. "This is incredibly helpful." Walter paused at the stairs. "One more thing, Mr. Clark. The lake has a way of drawing people in. People looking for answers, for closure, for understanding. Just be careful what questions you ask. Sometimes you get answers you weren't prepared for." Before Noah could respond to this cryptic warning, Walter had ascended the stairs, leaving him alone among the archives of Maplewood's past. Noah spent the next 2 hours immersed in local history, focusing on materials from 1993 to 1995, the year before and after the disappearance. The local newspaper, the Maplewood Chronicle, had provided extensive coverage of the case, including interviews with teachers, neighbors, and friends of the missing teens. Much of it Noah had already uncovered in his preliminary research, but the local perspective offered nuances that national coverage had missed. One article, dated August 1994, it described a town hall meeting where residents had gathered to discuss ongoing search efforts and safety concerns. According to the reporter, tensions had run high, with some community members calling for additional resources, while others questioned whether the teens had simply run away. A quote from an elderly resident named Martha Winters stood out. "This isn't the first time the lake has called to our children. We should have been watching more carefully." Noah made a note to look into previous incidents involving the lake and children. Walter's comments and now this cryptic statement from a town meeting suggested a pattern that might be relevant. As he continued digging, Noah found a folder containing copied pages from Maplewood High Schools. There they were: Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, and Danny Reeves, immortalized in their junior year portraits. Ellie's dark hair was pulled back, her expression serious, but with a hint of a smile. Marcus looked confident, his grin revealing slightly crooked front teeth. Danny's freckled face was captured mid-laugh, her eyes bright with humor. Noah studied their faces, trying to see beyond the standard yearbook poses to the personalities beneath. These weren't just case files or newspaper clippings anymore. They were real teenagers with hopes, dreams, fears, and secrets. What had happened to them on that summer night? What had they seen, heard, or remembered that led them to the lake? Checking his watch, Noah realized it was nearly 4 o'clock time for his meeting with Joyce from the grocery store. He carefully returned the materials to their proper places, left a few dollars in the copy fee jar for the pages he'd duplicated, and headed back upstairs. Walter was assisting an elderly couple with a donation of family photographs, but he nodded to Noah as he passed. "Find anything useful?" "Very much so, thank you. I'll definitely be back to continue researching. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 5, Walter replied. "Sunday and Monday by appointment only." Noah thanked him again and stepped back onto Main Street, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Lakeside Brew was just 2 blocks down, a cozy-looking cafe with large windows and a patio that would presumably be more appealing in warmer weather. Inside, the coffee shop had the comfortable, lived-in feel of a local gathering place, rather than a chain. Mismatched armchairs and wooden tables filled the space, and local artwork adorned the walls. The smell of freshly ground coffee and baked goods permeated the air. Noah ordered a black coffee and found a table in a quiet corner. He had just settled in when the bell above the door chimed, and Joyce from the grocery store entered. She spotted him immediately and made her way over after ordering. "Hope I didn't keep you waiting," she said, setting down her mug of tea. "Had to wait for my replacement to show up." Nodded. "I appreciate you making time to talk with me." Joyce unwound a colorful scarf from around her neck. "So you're writing about the missing kids. What exactly are you hoping to learn after all this time?" "The truth," Noah said simply. "What really happened to them? Why they went to the lake that night. Whether they're still out there somewhere." Joyce sipped her tea, regarding him over the rim of her mug. "Truth is a slippery thing in Maplewood, especially where the lake is concerned. You're the second person today to suggest the lake itself has some significance beyond being the location where they disappeared," Noah noted. Walter at the Historical Society hinted at the same thing. "Walter Fisher," Joyce smiled. that old romantic. Always been fascinated by the legends and folklore around here. But he's not wrong. The lake has a history. What kind of history? Joyce lowered her voice slightly, though the few other patrons were engaged in their own conversation. Native tribes that lived here before European settlement considered the lake sacred, but also dangerous. They believed it was a gateway of sorts, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. Later, when the town was first established in the 1800s, there were accounts of strange lights on the water, unexplained sounds, a few disappearances that were chalked up to drowning, though no bodies were ever recovered. Noah leaned forward. And you think these legends might be connected to what happened in 1994? Joyce shrugged. I'm just a grocery store manager, not a paranormal expert, but I know what people said at the time, and what they still say when they think outsiders aren't listening. That the lake takes people that it needs them somehow. Needs them for what? That's where the stories diverge. Some say it's hungry, others say it's lonely. The more religious folks think it's a punishment for sins, though they can never quite explain what sins 3 ordinary teenagers might have committed to deserve vanishing without a trace. Joyce sighed. I think people create these explanations because the alternative is too frightening, which is that the world is random, that terrible things happen for no reason at all. Joyce took another sip of tea. That said, there were odd things about that case that have never been properly explained. Like what? Noah pulled out his notebook, trying not to appear too eager. Well, for one, those symbols on the old oak tree, they appeared overnight, and no one ever saw who carved them. And then there was the matter of the dreams. Noah looked up sharply. Dreams? Joyce nodded. In the weeks before they disappeared, all 3 of them, Ellie, Marcus, and Danny, were reportedly having the same recurring dream. Something about standing on the shore while voices called to them from the water. At least that's what Ellie told my niece, who was in her biology class. I don't know if it ever came up in the official investigation. Noah's pulse quickened. This aligned with the journal entry Sheriff Reeves had quoted. Did your niece know if Ellie mentioned anything about trying to remember something from when they were 8 years old? Joyce's expression changed subtly. Surprise, followed by something like caution. No, nothing like that, but it's interesting you should mention that specific age. There was an incident at the lake the summer they would have been 8. A child drowned, a visiting cousin of the Fosters, I believe. It was hushed up somewhat, the family not wanting it widely discussed, but it affected many of the local children who witnessed the aftermath. The emergency vehicles, the search party. Were Ellie, Marcus, and Danny among those children? Joyce's brow furrowed in concentration. I can't say for certain. It's possible though. Many of the neighborhood children were playing at the lake that day. It was during the annual summer splash, a community picnic and swimming. Noah made a note to look into this drowning incident. If the 3 teens had witnessed it as children, it might explain the reference in Ellie's journal. Traumatic events could be suppressed, only to resurface years later. You mentioned the Fosters. Would that be the same family that owned the cabin I'm renting? Joyce nodded. The very same. Martin and Diane Foster. They moved to Arizona after their youngest son graduated high school. Couldn't bear to stay in Maplewood after what happened to their nephew and then the 3 teenagers. Too many ghosts, I suppose. Do you know if anyone has contact information for them? They might have insights about the drowning incident. I believe Walter at the Historical Society keeps a directory of former residents for research purposes. He might be able to help you there. Joyce checked her watch. I should be going soon. Dinner with my sister tonight, but there's something else you might want to know. What's that? Joyce hesitated, as if weighing whether to continue. There have been incidents over the years. Nothing as dramatic as the 1994 disappearances, but strange occurrences centered around the lake. People hearing voices when no one's there. Seeing figures standing at the shore that vanish when approached. And every few years, someone reports dreams similar to what the teenagers described. Standing at the water's edge, while something calls to them from beneath the surface. Noah felt a chill despite the warmth of the coffee shop. Has anyone else disappeared? No disappearances, thankfully, but there have been close calls. About 15 years ago, a local man was found wandering barefoot toward the lake at 3 a.m., with no memory of leaving his house. And just last year, a group of teenagers claimed they saw someone or something emerge from the water late at night, though most people dismissed it as a prank or the result of recreational substances. Joyce gathered her scarf and purse. The anniversary of the original disappearances is coming up soon, June 17th. That's when the lake seems most active. Thank you, Joyce. This has been incredibly helpful. She studied him with sudden intensity. "Be careful, Mr. Clark. The lake has a way of drawing in those who take too much interest in its secrets, especially those who stay in that cabin." "What do you mean?" "The Foster cabin has a reputation, being so close to where they disappeared. With a direct view of that stretch of people who stay there report strange dreams, unusual sounds. Most write it off to suggestion and wind in the trees. But," she trailed off, then shook her head, as if dismissing her own thoughts. "Just keep your wits about you, especially as we get closer to the anniversary." With that cryptic warning, Joyce bid him goodbye and left the coffee shop, the bell tinkling cheerfully above the door as she exited. Noah remained at the table, reviewing his notes and processing the new information. The drowning incident when the teens were 8 years old could be significant, a traumatic event they had collectively suppressed, only to have it resurface in dreams and memory fragments years later. It might explain the reference in Ellie's journal, though not why whatever was getting closer wanted them to remember it. As for the legends about the lake itself, those were harder to incorporate into a rational explanation. Every small town had its share of superstitions and ghost story. The fact that Maplewood centered around the lake was natural given its prominence in local geography and identity. Still, Noah couldn't dismiss the consistency of the accounts. Dreams of being called by the water, figures seen at the shore, symbols appearing without explanation. If nothing else, these elements formed the psychological backdrop against which the disappearances had occurred. After finishing his coffee, Noah decided to drive back to the cabin and organize his growing collection of notes and material. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as he walked to his car, casting long shadows across Main Street and turning the distant surface of the lake into a sheet of burnished gold. The drive back to the cabin took only 15 minutes. But as Noah turned onto the private road leading to his temporary home, he felt a subtle shift in his mood. The forest seemed darker here, the trees pressing closer to the road, branches reaching overhead like grasping fingers. It was simply the contrast between the open brightness of town and the dense woods, he told himself. Nothing more. As the cabin came into view, Noah was struck again by its isolation. Beautiful, yes, with its rustic charm and lake view, but utterly alone on this stretch of The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, according to the rental agent. Perfect for riding without distractions. Less perfect for someone researching a 30-year-old disappearance with potentially unsettling connections to the lake his temporary home overlooked. Noah parked and carried his groceries inside, pushing away the irrational sense of unease that had settled over him. After putting away the food and making a quick sandwich, he spread his research materials across the dining table, adding the new notes and photocopies from today's investigation. The drowning incident from 1985 warranted further research. If it had happened during a community event as Joyce suggested, there should be newspaper coverage, perhaps even photographs that might show if Ellie, Marcus and Danny were present. He made a note to look specifically for this when he returned to the Historical Society. Noah also wanted to locate and speak with the parents of the missing teenager. Sheriff Reeves had mentioned she would not discuss her sister's family, but perhaps Ellie's parents or Marcus's mother might be willing to share their perspectives. According to his earlier research, Ellie's parents had remained in Maplewood, while Marcus's mother had moved to a neighboring town after divorcing his father. As the evening progressed, Noah created a timeline on his laptop, incorporating all the information he'd gathered. The known facts were sparse. 3 17-year-olds had left their homes in the middle of the night on June 17, gone to the lake for unknown reasons, and disappeared without a trace. Their shoes were found at the shore, and footprints led into the water before stopping abruptly. Strange symbols were discovered, carved into a nearby tree. Years later, a waterlogged journal believed to belong to Ellie Chambers was found by a fisherman, containing a cryptic entry about something getting closer, and wanting them to remember events from when they were 8 years old. The new information added context but no definitive answers. A possible shared dream about being called by the water. A drowning incident when they were 8 that might have been traumatic enough to suppress. Local legends about the lake having some kind of supernatural significance. Noah rubbed his eyes, fatigue setting in after a long day of research and conversations. Through the window he could see the lake, now dark as the last light faded from the sky. The water was calm tonight, reflecting the emerging stars like a perfect mirror. It was beautiful, peaceful even. Hard to reconcile with the ominous warnings he'd received or with the fact that 3 teenagers had walked into that same water 30 years ago and never returned. As he watched, a slight movement at the shoreline caught his attention. Noah squinted, trying to make out details in the gathering darkness. Was that a figure standing at the water's edge? He strained his eyes, but whatever he'd seen, if anything, was gone now, lost in the shadows. Probably just a deer or other wildlife, Noah told himself. The forests around Maplewood were full of animals that would come to the lake to drink at dusk. Still, he found himself double-checking that the doors were locked before preparing for bed. In the shower, Noah replayed the day's conversations in his mind, analyzing what he'd learned and planning tomorrow's research direction. The case was more complex than he'd initially thought, with layers of local folklore, possible trauma, and personal connections intertwining with the core mystery. It would make for a compelling book if he could untangle even some of these threads. As he was drifting off to sleep, Noah found himself thinking about the cabin itself. Joyce had mentioned its reputation, strange dreams, unusual sounds experienced by previous occupants. Given its proximity to the disappearance site and its former ownership by the family whose nephew had drowned, it was almost a character in the story he was researching. His last conscious thought before sleep, claimed him, was to wonder if the foster cabin might hold secrets of its own. Hidden spaces, forgotten belongings, echoes of past events that could shed light on the mysteries of Maplewood Lake. When the dream came, it arrived with startling clarity. Noah stood at the shore of Maplewood Lake, his bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. The night was silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver path across the lake's surface that seemed to lead toward the distant center where the water was deepest. He wasn't alone. To his right stood a teenage girl with long dark hair, Ellie Chambers, exactly as she'd appeared in her yearbook photo. Though somehow Noah knew this wasn't a memory or imagination. She was really there, watching the water with anxious anticipation. To his left stood two more figures, Marcus and Danny, their faces solemn and expectant. None of them acknowledged Noah's presence. It was as if he was witnessing a moment frozen in time, a fragment of that June night. "I can hear you," Ellie whispered, her voice carrying clearly despite her soft tone. The water before them began to stir. Not with wind or current, but as if something beneath the surface was rising. The moonlit path across the lake rippled and distorted. "We shouldn't be here," Marcus said, shifting uneasily. "This doesn't feel right." Danny reached for Ellie's hand. "We promised we'd never come back." "But we have to remember," Ellie replied, her voice strange, distant. "It won't stop until we remember." The surface of the lake bulged upward, water cascading off a shape that was emerging from the depths. Noah tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move, as if they had rooted into the sand. He wanted to shout to warn the teenagers, but no sound emerged from his throat. The shape rising from the lake began to take form, a figure made of darkness and water, its edges constantly shifting and flowing. It had no definable features except for two pale lights where eyes should be, glowing with an eerie phosphorescence. It reached toward the shore with limbs that stretched impossibly, elongating across the distance. One watery tendril touched Ellie's cheek, leaving glistening droplets on her skin. "I remember now," she whispered. "I remember what we did." The figure's mouth opened, a black void in its fluid face, and a sound emerged that wasn't a voice, wasn't a song, but something between the two, calling in a language that Noah shouldn't have understood but somehow did. It was saying his name. Noah jerked awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bedroom was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. His skin was clammy with sweat, sheets tangled around his legs, as if he'd been thrashing in his sleep. Just a dream, he told himself. Just a vivid, unsettling dream, induced by a day spent immersed in the details of the disappearances. His subconscious had simply assembled a narrative from the fragments he'd gathered. The references to dreams of being called by the water, Ellie's journal entry, the local legends about the lake. But as his breathing steadied and his pulse slowed, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than an ordinary dream. The clarity, the sensory details, the emotional weight of it lingered in a way his usual dreams did not. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, checking the time, 3:17. The exact time that Joyce had mentioned a figure was captured emerging from the water on a security camera, the night before the most recent disappearances. A coincidence, Noah told himself firmly. Nothing more. But he didn't fall back asleep until the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the curtains. and even then his rest was shallow and uneasy, haunted by the memory of dark water and a voice that knew his name. Chapter 3. March 18. Noah woke later than intended, the sun already high in the sky. His night of disrupted sleep had left him groggy and disoriented, the vivid dream still lingering at the edges of his consciousness, like a half-remembered conversation. After a quick breakfast and a much-needed strong cup of coffee, he sat at the dining table with his laptop, determined to approach his research with clear-headed rationality. Dreams were just dreams, the product of an active imagination combined with the suggestive power of local legends and his immersion in the case details. Still, he found himself making notes about the dream while it was still fresh in his mind. The specific visual of something emerging from the water, the teenager's comments about remembering and promising never to return, the strange figure with glowing eyes, all elements that might or might not connect to the actual case. At minimum, they provided potential creative angles for the narrative structure of his book. Noah's plan for the day was to return to the Historical Society and specifically research the drowning incident Joyce had mentioned. If a child had died during a community event the summer Ellie, Marcus and Danny were 8 years old, there should be newspaper coverage or other documentation. Before leaving, Noah stood at the window overlooking the lake, studying the scene in daylight. The water was a deep blue under the clear sky, gently rippling in the light breeze. The shore where in his dream he had stood with the 3 teenagers was visible from this vantage point. A small crescent of sandy beach bounded by pine trees on either side. Was that the actual spot where they had disappeared? The police report hadn't specified exact coordinates, only referring to the eastern shore. Noah made a mental note to ask Sheriff Reeves or Walter for more precise information about the location. If his rental cabin happened to overlook the very spot where the teenagers had vanished, that would be a remarkable coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence at all, given Joyce's comments about the cabin's reputation. At the Historical Society, Walter Fisher greeted Noah with a nod of recognition. Back already, I see. Must have found something worth pursuing. Indeed, Noah replied. Actually, I'm looking for information about a specific incident. A drowning that reportedly occurred during a community event called the Summer Splash in night. The victim was supposedly a nephew of the Foster family. Walter's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been talking to the locals, I see. Yes, that would be Timothy Foster, age 10. Tragic incident. His parents had sent him to stay with his uncle and aunt for the summer. Martin and Diane Foster, the previous owners of your cabin, as you might know. What happened exactly? Walter led Noah toward the archives door. Let's look at the newspaper coverage. The Maplewood Chronicle did a fairly comprehensive article, though the family requested privacy for certain details. In the basement archive, Walter located a bound volume of newspapers from 19... Here we are, he said, pointing to a front-page headline. Local boy drowns during summer splash event. Noah read the article carefully. According to the reporter, 10-year-old Timothy Foster had been playing with other children near the lake during the annual community picnic, when he apparently wandered away from the supervised swimming area. When his absence was noticed approximately 40 minutes later, a search began. His body was recovered from the lake several hours later, in an area known as the Deep End, where underwater currents were particularly strong. The article quoted the county coroner stating that the cause of death was accidental drowning, though Timothy had been known as a strong swimmer for his age. Martin Foster, the boy's uncle, was quoted saying only, "This is a devastating loss for our family. We ask for privacy during this difficult time." A smaller article on page 3, dated a week later, covered the funeral service. It included a photograph of mourners gathered at Maplewood Cemetery, including Martin and Diane Foster, with a younger couple identified as Timothy's parents, visiting from Illinois. In the background of the image, partially obscured but still recognizable, were several children. Noah leaned closer, studying their faces. Are these the only photographs from the funeral? He asked Walter. I believe so. The family requested minimal coverage, as you might imagine. Walter peered over Noah's shoulder. Are you looking for someone specific? I'm trying to determine if Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, and Danny Reeves were present. They would have been around 8 years old at the time. Walter squinted at the photograph. Hard to say for certain. The children in the background aren't identified in the caption, and the image quality isn't the best. You might have better luck with school photographs from that period, class pictures that would show all three of them at that age. Do you have those in your archives? Some. Maplewood Elementary donated their collection of class photographs when they digitized their records a few years ago. They should be in the education section. Third shelf from the bottom. Noah thanked him and spent the next hour searching through elementary school class photographs. He finally located the second grade classes from 1984-1985. To his surprise, all three missing teenagers had been in the same class. Miss Patterson's second grade students were arranged in 3 neat rows, with Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt and Danielle Reeves identified in the caption beneath. Ellie stood in the back row, her dark hair in neat braids, her expression serious even. Marcus was in the front, one of the shorter boys, with a missing front tooth and the same confident grin he would carry into adolescence. Danny sat cross-legged on the floor in the very front, freckles sprinkled across her nose, her smile wide and genuine. So they had known each other since at least second grade, perhaps earlier. That aligned with what Noah had read about their friendship being long established by the time of their disappearance, but it didn't confirm whether they had witnessed Timothy Foster's drowning or funeral. Noah continued searching and found another photograph that provided a stronger connection. In the Maplewood Chronicle's coverage of the summer splash event itself, the issue published just days before the drowning, there was a large spread of community photos. One image showed children participating in a sandcastle contest. The caption identified several participants, including Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt and Danny Reeves, all age 8, with their Mermaid Kingdom creation. So they had definitely been at the summer splash event where Timothy Foster drowned. Whether they had witnessed anything related to his death remained unclear, but this established their presence at what must have been a traumatic community event, especially for children their age. Noah made photocopies of the relevant articles and photographs, then returned to the main floor of the Historical Society. Walter was assisting another visitor, so Noah waited patiently, reviewing his finding. The timing aligned perfectly with Ellie's journal reference to that summer when we were 8. If the 3 friends had witnessed something disturbing related to Timothy Foster's drowning, perhaps seen him struggling in the water, or even tried to help him, it could have been traumatic enough to suppress. But why would something or someone want them to remember it 9 years later? And how did that connect to their own disappearance? When Walter was free, Noah approached him with another question. I'm also interested in the symbols found carved into a tree near the lake after the 1994 disappearances. Do you have any information about those? Walter's expression grew more serious. Those. Yes. They caused quite a stir at the time. No one could determine their origin or meaning, though theories abounded. He moved to a filing cabinet and extracted a folder labeled 19. From it he produced several photographs of the carved symbols. The images were clearer than the one Sheriff Reeves had shown Noah. The symbols appeared to be deeply carved into the bark of an ancient oak, forming a complex pattern of curved and straight lines, circles and what looked like stylized waves. Something about them nagged at Noah's memory, as if he'd seen similar markings somewhere before.
Has anyone ever determined what language or symbol system these might belong to? Noah asked, studying the photographs carefully. Walter shook his head. Not definitively. Several experts were consulted at the time. Linguists, anthropologists, historians of indigenous cultures. No consensus was reached. Some suggested they resembled ancient Norse runes. Others pointed to similarities with Native American pictographs specific to Great Lakes tribes. A few fringe theorists claimed they were something entirely unique to the lake itself. May I make copies of these? Of course. Walter watched as Noah carefully placed the photographs on the copier. You seem particularly interested in these symbols. Noah hesitated before responding. They're central to the mystery. Whatever drew those teenagers to the lake that night, I suspect these markings are connected to it. There's something else you should know, Walter said, his voice lowering slightly though they were alone in the room. Those symbols, they've been seen before and sent, not as carvings, but in other forms. Noah looked up sharply. What do you mean? Timothy Foster, the boy who drowned in 1985, was found with similar patterns drawn on his palm in what appeared to be blue ink. The coroner's report mentioned it as an unexplained detail, and about 5 years after the teenagers disappeared, a local artist began painting eerily similar designs, claiming they came to her in dreams. She moved away eventually. Too many questions.
Too much attention when people made the connection. Do you have any documentation of those instances? Walter shook his head. Nothing I can share officially. The coroner's report details would be in county records, not our archives. And the artist, Sophia Leonard was her name, took her paintings with her when she left. But I saw them myself. The resemblance was unsettling. Noah finished making his copies and returned the originals to Walter. Thank you for telling me this. It might be an important connection. Walter replaced the folder in the cabinet. Mr. Clark, I notice you're staying at the Foster cabin. That's right. You should know that property has a history beyond just its former owner's connection to Timothy's drowning. Walter seemed to choose his next words carefully. It's situated at what some locals consider a sensitive spot on the lake. Sensitive. The native people who lived here long before Maplewood was established believed certain locations around the lake served as crossing points between worlds. The eastern shore where the Foster cabin stands was one such place. According to their beliefs, the veil between our world and the spirit world is thinnest there. Noah thought of his unsettling dream, the feeling that the cabin itself was somehow watching him. Have there been incidents at that specific location before then? Nothing officially documented, but local folklore mentions it repeatedly. Strange sightings, unexplained sounds. Even the drowning of Timothy Foster occurred not far from there, though the summer splash event was held at the public beach on the northern shore. Walter paused. I'm not suggesting you believe in such things, of course, just providing historical context. I appreciate that, Noah said, gathering his materials. History and folklore often contain kernels of truth, even if the interpretations vary over time. Walter nodded, seemingly pleased with this diplomatic response. Will you be returning tomorrow? Most likely. There's still more I'd like to research, especially about the community's response to the drowning in 1985, and any possible connections to the 1994 disappearances. Will be he and Mr. Clark. Walter hesitated. If you experience anything unusual at the cabin, I'd be interested to hear about it. For the historical record, of course. Of course, Noah echoed, wondering exactly what Walter expected him to experience. Outside, the afternoon had turned cloudy, a change from the bright morning. Noah checked his watch just past 3 p.m. He decided to drive to the public beach on the northern shore of the lake, where the summer splash event had been held. Seeing the actual locations relevant to his research might give him a better sense of the geography and spatial relationships involved. The public beach was easy to find, with clear signage directing visitors from the main road. In March, the area was deserted, picnic tables empty, the small concession stand closed for the season, the beach itself a stretch of undisturbed sand meeting the gently lapping water of the lake. Noah parked and walked to the shore, trying to imagine the scene as it would have been during the summer splash event, nearly 40 years ago. Children building sand castles, families picnicking, swimmers splashing in the designated area marked by buoy, and somewhere among them, 8-year-old Ellie, Marcus and Danny working on their Mermaid Kingdom creation, while 10-year-old Timothy Foster somehow wandered away from supervision to a deeper, more dangerous part of the lake. The newspaper had mentioned the deep end as the area where Timothy drowned. Noah scanned the lake, wondering which section that referred to. The water appeared relatively uniform from the shore, though he knew lakes often had dramatic underwater topography, sudden drop-offs, deep channels, underwater currents invisible from the surface. As Noah stood contemplating the lake, a jogger approached along the shoreline path. The man slowed as he drew near, his curious gaze taking in Noah's presence at the empty beach. Bit cold for swimming, the jogger remarked with a friendly smile. Just looking, Noah replied. I'm staying nearby for a few weeks, thought I'd explore the area. The man nodded. First time in Maplewood? Actually no, I lived here briefly as a child, but it's been many years. Returning to old haunts. I'm Pete, by the way. Pete Lawson. He extended a hand. Noah Clark. They shook hands. Do you live local? Born and raised here except for college and a few years working in Chicago. Couldn't stay away though. Something about this place gets in your blood. Pete gestured toward the lake. Especially this old girl. Prettiest lake in the state if you ask me. Noah saw an opportunity. I was actually wondering about a particular part of the lake people call the deep end. Do you know where that is? Pete's expression shifted subtly. Sure, it's about a quarter-mile that way. He pointed southeast. See where the shoreline curves in? Just beyond that point, The lake bottom drops off dramatically, goes from about 10 feet deep to nearly 100 in a short distance. Underwater currents too, especially when the wind's up. Why do you ask? I'm researching local history for a book. There was a drowning there in the night. Timothy Foster, Pete said immediately. I remember it well. I was about 12 when it happened. Changed how the whole town related to the lake. Swimming lessons became mandatory in school after that. The summer splash was cancelled for several years, and when they brought it back, the security was intense. Lifeguards everywhere, buddy system strictly enforced. Were you at the event when it happened? Pete nodded soberly. Didn't see anything directly, but I remember the commotion when they realized he was missing. The search, the ambulances, not something you forget, especially in a small town where everyone knows everyone. Did you know the Foster family? Not well. They kept to themselves most. Martin Foster worked for the power company, managed the local substation. His wife Diane taught piano lessons. They had 2 sons of their own, both younger than Timothy. Nice people, but devastated after what happened. Never seemed quite the same. Noah hesitated, then asked, did you also know Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, and Danny Reeves? Pete's face registered immediate recognition, followed by wariness. The missing teenagers, they were a few years behind me in school. Didn't know them personally. He studied Noah more carefully now. Your book is about them, isn't it? The disappearances. Yes, I'm trying to understand what happened to them. Pete sighed. Good luck with that. 30 years of speculation hasn't brought any answer, though I'm guessing you've already heard all the theories. Runaway teens, tragic accident, foul play, supernatural elements, depending on who you talk to. I've heard some. Yes. Do you have a theory? Me? I think they went for a late night swim and got into trouble. Maybe they swam out too far, got caught in a current, panicked. It happens, even with good swimmers. Pete shrugged. The mystery is why they went there in the middle of the night in the first place, and why no bodies were ever found. The lake usually gives up its dead eventually. Noah nodded thoughtfully. The local paper mentioned that Timothy Foster was a strong swimmer too. Seems strange that he would drown in an area known to be dangerous. Something flickered across Pete's face, a brief shadow of unease. Kids that age think they're invincible, and the currents in the deep end can catch even experienced swimmers off guard. True, Noah acknowledged. By the way, I'm staying at what I believe was the Foster family's cabin on the eastern shore. Do you know if that area has any particular significance local? Pete's expression closed slightly. Other than being where those teenagers were last seen, not really. Just another stretch of shoreline. But his averted gaze, and the slight tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. I've heard some locals consider it a special place. Something about Native American beliefs regarding crossing points between worlds. Pete gave a short laugh that sounded forced. Maplewood loves its legends. Every small town needs its ghost stories, I suppose. He glanced at his watch. I should get moving. Trying to finish my run before the rain hits. Those clouds don't look friendly. Noah looked up at the darkening sky. Thanks for the information. It was nice meeting you. Likewise, Pete replied, already beginning to jog away. Enjoy your stay in Maplewood, Mr. Clark. And a word of advice. Some old stories are better left undisturbed. Noah watched him disappear down the path, noting how quickly the man had shifted from friendly conversation to polite withdrawal once the topic turned to local legends and the eastern shore. Another resident uncomfortable with discussing the deeper mysteries of Maplewood Lake. The wind was picking up now, sending small waves slapping against the shore and rustling through the trees behind the beach. The gathering clouds cast the lake in shades of slate gray, the water suddenly appearing cold and forbidding rather than inviting. Noah decided to head back to the cabin before the rain began. As he drove, Noah's thoughts returned to the symbols in the photograph. Something about them continued to nag at his memory, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. Had he seen similar markings in his research on other cases, in a book on ancient languages or symbol, or was it something from his own brief childhood in Maplewood? A memory as submerged as whatever secrets lay beneath the surface of the lake. By the time Noah reached the cabin, fat raindrops were beginning to fall, quickly increasing to a steady downpour. He hurried inside, the earlier sense of unease returning as he entered the empty rooms. In the growing darkness of the storm, the cabin seemed different, the corners deeper, the air heavier, the silence beneath the drumming rain. Somehow expect. Noah turned on lights in every room,
dispelling the shadows and set about making an early dinner. As he chopped vegetables for a simple stir-fry, he mentally reviewed what he'd learned today. The connections between Timothy Foster's drowning in 1985 and the disappearance of the teenagers in 1994 were becoming clearer. Both incidents had occurred in proximity to the eastern shore, where his cabin stood. Both involved mysterious symbols. Both had happened in June, albeit 9 years apart. The question was whether these connections were meaningful or coincidental. Had Ellie, Marcus, and Danny witnessed something during the drowning incident that led them back to the lake 9 years later? Had they been involved in some way? And how did the strange symbols fit into the picture? After dinner, Noah spread his research materials across the dining table once more. Adding the new photocopies and notes from today's investigations, he created a timeline that included both the 1985 drowning and the 1994 disappearances, marking the connections and unanswered questions. The rain continued to fall, occasionally gusting against the windows when the wind shifted. Noah found the sound oddly comforting as he worked, a natural white noise that helped him focus. Outside, the lake would be choppy now, its surface broken by countless raindrops, its depth stirred by unseen currents. Around 10 p.m., as Noah was organizing his notes for the next day's research, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out complete. The cabin plunged into darkness, the only sound the intensified patter of rain, and the sudden creaking of the structure as wind buffeted its walls. Noah fumbled for his phone, activating the flashlight function. The rental agent had mentioned emergency supplies in a closet near the kitchen, including candles and matches. He made his way carefully through the darkened space, finding the closet and retrieving what he needed. With several candles lit and placed strategically around the main room, Noah decided to call it a night. There was little more he could accomplish without electricity, and the flickering candlelight was creating unsettling shadows that danced across the walls and ceiling, playing tricks on his peripheral vision. In the bathroom, preparing for bed by candlelight, Noah caught a glimpse of something in the mirror that made him freeze. For just an instant he thought he saw a figure standing behind him, a child's silhouette, dripping wet, watching him with hollow eye. Noah spun around, heart hammering, but the bathroom was empty save for the wavering shadows cast by his candle. Just my imagination, he told himself firmly. The combination of the power outage, the storm, and a day spent immersed in stories of drowning and disappearance was affecting his perception. There was no one in the cabin but him. Still, Noah double-checked that the front and back doors were securely locked before retreating to the bedroom, taking a candle with him. The rain continued its rhythmic assault on the roof and windows, occasionally punctuated by distant thunder. Not ideal sleeping conditions, but Noah was tired enough that he hoped he would drift off despite the noise and lingering unease. He was nearly asleep when a sound jolted him back to alertness. A gentle, persistent tapping, not the random patter of rain, but a deliberate rhythm. Tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. Noah sat up, listening intently. The sound seemed to be coming from the window beside his bed. Slowly, he leaned toward it, squinting through the rain-streaked glass into the darkness outside. For several long moments he saw nothing. Then a flash of lighting illuminated the scene, and Noah's breath caught in his throat. A child stood on the deck outside his window, a boy of perhaps 10. Wearing what appeared to be old-fashioned swimming trunks. His pale skin was slick with water, dark hair plastered to his forehead. In the brief flash of light, Noah could see his lips moving, saying something Noah couldn't hear over the storm. Then darkness returned, and with it, the tapping resumed. Noah's rational mind offered explanations. A neighbor's child playing a prank, his own imagination conjuring a figure from the storm shadows, a waking dream as he drifted between sleep and consciousness. But a deeper part of him recognized the boy from his research earlier, that Timothy Foster, exactly as he would have appeared the day he drowned in night. The tapping continued, insistent now. Noah forced himself to move toward the window, heart pounding so loudly he could hear it above the storm. The rain made it difficult to see clearly, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out a small figure on the deck. The rational explanations dissolved. No real child would be outside in this storm, at this hour, at this isolated camp. Whatever stood on the other side of the glass was something else entirely. "What do you want?" Noah whispered, though he knew the figure couldn't hear him through the closed window. Another flash of lighting illuminated the scene, and this time, Noah saw the boy more clearly. His eyes were not those of a child. They held a depth and knowledge that sent a chill through Noah's body. The boy raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. On his palm, drawn in what appeared to be blue ink, were the same symbols Noah had seen in the photographs earlier. That the tapping stopped. In the sudden silence, Noah heard a voice, not outside the window, but seemingly inside his own head. "Remember," it whispered. "You have to remember." Then the figure was gone, vanished between one lighting flash and the next, leaving only rain streaming down the empty glass. Noah stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had seen, or thought he had seen. The line between reality and imagination, between waking and dreaming, seemed suddenly as fluid and uncertain as the boundary between land and lake during a storm. He didn't remember returning to bed, but sometime later, Noah jerked awake from a deep sleep. The storm had passed, leaving behind a gentle patter of diminishing rain. The power was still out. His candle burned down to a stop. Had he dreamed the entire incident? The tapping, the child's face at the window, the symbols on a drowned boy's, it seemed the most likely explanation. Yet the experience had carried a weight and clarity unlike any dream Noah could recall. He lay awake until dawn, listening to the rain and the creaking of the cabin, wondering what other memories this place might stir, both in himself and in whatever presence seemed to linger between its walls. When morning came, Noah rose exhausted but determined to maintain his rational perspective. The strange experiences of the night, whether dreamed or not, only underscored the psychological impact of the case he was researching. If he, a detached investigator with no personal connection to the disappearances, could be so affected by the atmosphere and legends surrounding Maplewood Lake, how much more powerful must those influences have been for three impressionable teenagers who had grown up in their shack? As Noah made coffee on the gas stove, thankfully still functioning despite the power outage, he gazed out at the lake. The storm had cleared, leaving the water smooth as glass under a pale blue sky. No sign remained of the turbulence of the night before, no evidence of a dripping child standing on his deck. Yet as Noah sipped his coffee, he couldn't shake the phrase that had echoed in his mind as he drifted in and out of uneasy sleep throughout the night. "Remember, you have to remember." The same message that, according to Ellie's journal, had drawn three teenagers to this lake 30 years ago, and from which they had never returned.
Noah stood at the edge of the water, watching the morning mist rise from the lake's surface. The air was crisp after the storm, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. He'd spent the early hours reviewing his notes, trying to separate fact from speculation, experience from imagination. The power had returned around 8 a.m., accompanied by the sudden whir of the refrigerator and a brief flicker of lights. Noah had immediately checked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for footprints or any evidence of a visitor during the night. The rain-soaked ground revealed nothing conclusive, just indistinct depressions that could have been made by anything from deer to neighborhood dogs to figments of his sleep-deprived mind. His cell phone showed 3 missed calls from Liz. He texted her a brief reassurance that he was fine, just dealing with a power outage from the storm. He wasn't ready to share his experiences from the previous night, knowing how they would sound to someone who wasn't here, feeling the weight of this place and its history. "Remember, you have to remember." The phrase continued to echo in his thoughts. What was he supposed to remember? He'd been only 6 years old when he lived in Maplewood. His memories of that time were fragmented, disconnected images and impressions rather than a coherent narrative. Yet something about those symbols tugged at him. He pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd taken of the copied images. In the clear light of morning, away from Walter's watchful presence, he studied them carefully. The markings seemed to shift between recognizable patterns and abstract shapes depending on how he focused his gaze. There was a rhythm to them, a cadence his eyes could almost follow. A sudden splash from the lake broke his concentration. Noah looked up sharply, scanning the water's surface, but saw only expanding ripples where something, a fish perhaps or a turtle, had disturbed the calm. He shook his head, trying to clear it. One night in this place and he was already jumping at shadow. He needed more information, concrete facts to anchor his investigation. The Historical Society had provided valuable context, but Noah wanted to speak with people who had been directly involved. Ellie's Aunt Karen was still his primary target, but he should also try to locate anyone connected to Timothy Foster. The boy's parents might still be alive and he'd had siblings according to Pete Lawson. Noah returned to the cabin and opened his laptop, grateful for the restored internet connection. A search for Martin and Diane Foster, Maplewood, yielded several results, including a 10-year-old obituary for Martin Foster. The notice mentioned that he was survived by his wife Diane and 2 sons, James and Michael. No current address for Diane, but it was a start. Further searching revealed that a Michael Foster was listed as the owner of Foster's Hardware on Main Street. That seemed too convenient to be coincidence in a town this size. Noah made a note to visit the store later that day. His phone buzzed with a text from Liv. "Glad you're okay. Any ghostly visitors in the night?" Noah stared at the message, unsettled by its uncanny accuracy. He typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "Just the usual storm noises in an old cabin. How's the gallery prep going?" Her reply came moments later. "Exhausting but exciting. 1 week until installation begins. Missing you." "Missing you too," he replied, then added, "This place is stranger than I expected." 3 dots appeared as Liv typed. "Disappeared, then reappeared. Trust your instincts but don't let the atmosphere get to you. You've always been sensitive to the energy of places." Noah smiled wryly. Liv's artist sensibilities often led her to frame things in terms of energy and impression. Usually he gently teased her about it, but today her perspective felt oddly comforting. Maybe what he'd experienced was simply his mind's way of processing the concentrated energy of a place marked by tragedy. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Noah decided to head into town. His first stop would be Foster's Hardware, followed by another session at the Historical Society archives. If time permitted, he'd try to locate Karen Chambers as well. Main Street was busier than it had been during his previous visit. The sidewalks populated with locals going about their Saturday errands. Noah found Foster's Hardware easily. A well-maintained storefront with a traditional red and white sign. The window display featured seasonal gardening supplies and a poster advertising an upcoming community fishing derby. A bell jingled as Noah entered the store. The interior was exactly what one would expect from a small-town hardware store. Neatly organized aisles of tools and supplies, the comforting smell of wood, metal and the faint chemical undertone of paint and solvent. A middle-aged man stood behind the counter, helping an elderly customer select the right type of light bulbs. Noah browsed, taking his time, observing the proprietor. Michael Foster appeared to be in his early 40s, which aligned with what Noah knew of the family time. He had a solid build, thinning brown hair, and a friendly but efficient manner with customers. Nothing about him immediately suggested a man haunted by family tragedy. When the elderly customer departed, Noah approached the counter. "Good morning. Are you Michael Foster?" The man looked up, his expression polite but slightly guarded. "That's right. What can I help you with today?" Noah extended his hand. "My name is Noah Clark. I'm researching local history for a book I'm writing, and I was hoping I might talk with you about your family's connection to Maplewood Lake." Michael's handshake was firm, but his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of?" "A historical examination of significant events in the area, particularly those centered around the lake. I understand your brother Timothy drowned there in night." Michael released Noah's hand and busied himself straightening items on the counter. "That was a long time ago, Mr. Clark. I'm not sure what I could tell you that isn't already in the public record. Sometimes personal perspectives offer insights that official records can't capture," Noah said carefully. "I'm particularly interested in the community's relationship with the lake over time, how it changed after the tragedy, and again after the disappearances in 1994. Michael looked up sharply. "So that's what this is really about, the missing teenager." "Both events are significant parts of the lake's history," Noah acknowledged, "and I believe they may be connected in ways that haven't been fully explored." "Connected how?" "That's what I'm trying to understand. There are certain patterns, certain similarities." The bell jingled as another customer entered the store. Michael glanced up, then back at Noah. "Look, I'm working right now. If you want to talk, come by after closing. 5:30. We can grab a coffee at the diner across the street." "Thank you, I appreciate that." Michael nodded curtly, then turned his attention to the new customer. Noah left, feeling a small sense of accomplishment mixed with apprehension. Michael's reluctance was evident, but at least he hadn't refused outright. With several hours to fill before the meeting, Noah decided to return to the Historical Society. There was still more to learn about the community's response to both tragedies, and he was curious whether the archives held any information about the local artist Walter had mentioned, Sophia Leonard, who had painted the mysterious symbols after the teenagers disappeared. Walter wasn't at the desk when Noah arrived. Instead, a young woman with curly red hair and horn-rimmed glasses greeted him. Her name tag identified her as Molly, volunteer archivist. "Good morning," Noah said. "I was here yesterday working with Walter on some research about Maplewood Lake history." Oh yes, he mentioned you might return, Molly said brightly. The disappearance case, right? Walter said you were particularly interested in the symbols found at the foster cabin. Noah nodded, noting that information traveled quickly in the small organization. That's right. Today I'm hoping to find some information about a local artist named Sophia Leonard. She was active in the late 1990s, I believe. Molly's eyes widened slightly. The dream paint, that's an interesting connection to pursue. Dream painter, that's what some locals called her. She claimed the images in her paintings came to her in dreams. Molly lowered her voice, though they were alone in the reception area. After people realized the symbols in her work matched those found at the disappearance site, there was quite a controversy. Some thought she might know something about what happened to those kids, but the police investigated and found no evidence of involvement. Do you have any of her work in your archives, or newspaper articles about the controversy? We don't have any original artwork, but there might be newspaper coverage in our digital archives. The Maplewood Gazette did a feature on her gallery opening around, and there should be articles about the controversy that followed. Molly gestured toward a computer station. I can help you access those files if you'd like. Noah spent the next 2 hours combing through digital newspaper archives, finding several articles about Sophia Leonard and her controversial artwork. The Gazette had indeed covered her gallery opening in October 1999. Featuring a photograph of the artist standing beside one of her larger paintings. Though the black and white newsprint reproduction was grainy, Noah could make out patterns in the artwork that resembled the symbols from the cabin. More telling was a follow-up article from January 2000, titled "Local Artist Denies Connection to Lake Mystery." According to the piece, Leonard had been questioned by police after multiple residents noted the similarities between her paintings and the symbols found at the foster cabin. She maintained that the images came to her in recurring dreams that began in 1995, approximately a year after the teenagers disappeared. The article quoted her, "I'd never been to that cabin. I never met those kids. What appears in my dreams and what I put on canvas is beyond my conscious control. If there's a connection, it's not one I can explain." By March 2000, a final article reported that Leonard had closed her gallery and left Maplewood due to harassment and unfounded accusations from community members. No forwarding address was provided. Noah made copies of the articles, then asked Molly if she knew of any way to contact Sophia Leonard today. "I don't, unfortunately," Molly replied. "But," she hesitated, then continued in a lower voice, "my Aunt Cheryl was friends with her. They still exchange Christmas cards. I could ask if she'd be willing to pass along a message. I'd appreciate that," Noah said, writing his phone number and email address on a slip of paper. "Please tell her I'm researching the historical context of those symbols, not trying to reopen old accusations." As Noah left the Historical Society, he checked his watch. Still a few hours before his meeting with Michael Foster. On impulse, he decided to drive to the eastern shore of the lake, a different section from where his cabin was located. According to his research, this area had been the site of a small Ojibwe settlement in the early 1800s, before white settlers established Maplewood. The road curved around the lake, occasionally offering glimpses of water between trees and private property. About 3 miles from his cabin, a small turnout provided access to a public shoreline area. A weathered sign identified it as Eastern Shore Nature Area, and displayed a brief description of the local flora and fauna. Noah parked and followed a narrow trail down to the water. This part of the shore was rockier than the beach on the northern side, with large boulders interspersed among smaller stones. A fallen tree created a natural bench overlooking the lake. The area was deserted, not surprising for a chilly March afternoon. Noah sat on the fallen tree gazing out at the water. From this vantage point, he could just make out his cabin on the far shore, a tiny structure partially obscured by trees. Something about this place felt different from the rest of the lakeshore. Quieter, more watchful. Noah remembered Walter's words about the native people believing certain locations around the lake served as crossing points between worlds, with the eastern shore being one such place. Sitting there, Noah could almost understand why such beliefs might arise. The quality of light, the way sound carried across the water, the subtle shifting of shadows, all combined to create an atmosphere that felt somehow liminal, as if the boundary between different states of being might indeed be thinner here. A movement in the water caught his attention, a series of ripples expanding outward from a point about 20 yards offshore, too large for a fish, too patterned for random wave action. Noah watched, intrigued, as the ripples continued to form and expand in an almost rhythmic sequence. Without conscious intention, Noah found himself walking to the water's edge, eyes fixed on the strange ripple pattern. The water lapped gently at the rocks,
clear enough that he could see the lake bottom sloping away from shore. As he watched, the ripples ceased and the surface became mirror smooth again, reflecting the cloudy sky above. Then, in the glassy surface of the water, Noah saw not just the reflection of clouds, but what appeared to be shapes moving beneath them, indistinct forms that seemed to shift and flow like shadows underwater, but visible only in the reflection, not in the lake itself. Noah blinked hard, certain he was experiencing some kind of visual distortion. When he looked again, the water showed only normal reflections of sky and shoreline. He stepped back, suddenly aware that he'd been holding his breath. A sharp caw broke the silence, a crow watching him from a nearby pine. The bird's dark eyes seemed unnaturally intent, following his movements. As Noah turned to look directly at it, the crow cawed once more and took flight, circling low over the water before disappearing into the tree. The encounter left Noah unsettled. He returned to his car, unable to shake the feeling that the lake was revealing itself to him incrementally, testing his receptiveness to its mystery. A rational explanation suggested itself. His mind, primed by research and local legends, was interpreting normal natural phenomena through a filter of expectation, yet that explanation felt insufficient against the weight of his experiences. By the time Noah arrived at the diner to meet Michael Foster, he had composed himself, organizing his thoughts and questions for the upcoming conversation. The diner was busy with the late afternoon crowd, but Noah spotted Michael at a corner booth, already nursing a cup of coffee. "Thank you for meeting me," Noah said, sliding into the seat opposite him. Michael nodded, his expression guarded. "I closed up early. Saturdays are usually busy, but I have good staff." He studied Noah for a moment. "You said you're writing a book about the lake." "Yeah, I'm particularly interested in events that have shaped the community's relationship with the lake over time. And you think my brother's drowning is connected to those teenagers disappearing 9 years later?" "It wasn't a question. I think it's a possibility worth exploring," Noah said carefully. Both incidents occurred in proximity to the eastern shore. Both happened in June, and both involved unusual symbols. Michael's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Symbols? What are you talking about?" Noah hesitated, suddenly uncertain. Had he made an assumption? "According to the coroner's report, your brother was found with strange markings drawn on his palm in blue ink. Similar symbols were later discovered carved into trees near the Foster cabin where the teenagers disappeared." Michael set his cup down slowly. "I've never heard anything about markings on Timmy's hand, and I read that coroner's report, every word of it, many times." Noah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning. "I was told this information by Walter Jenkins at the Historical Society. He said it was mentioned in the report." "Well, he's mistaken," Michael said firmly. "Or you misunderstood. There was nothing like that in the report. I apologize for the error," Noah said, mentally noting to verify this information. "Can you tell me anything about the day your brother drowned?" "You would have been quite young. I was 5. James was 3. We weren't at the summer splash. We had chicken pox. Both of us. Mom was home with us while Dad took Timmy to the event." Michael's voice was flat, rehearsed as if he'd told this story many times before. "We didn't know anything was wrong until Dad came home alone that evening. I remember him kneeling in front of us trying to explain, but he couldn't get the words out, just kept saying Timmy's gone over and over." "I'm very sorry," Noah said quietly. Michael nodded acknowledgement. "It destroyed our family." Mom withdrew into herself. Dad started drinking. They divorced 3 years later. Dad stayed in Maplewood until his death. Mom moved to Arizona with James and me. I only came back after college, when my uncle offered me a position in the store. "When did your family sell the cabin on the eastern shore?" "Almost immediately after Timmy's death. Dad couldn't bear to go there anymore. It sat empty for years. No one wanted to buy it after what happened. Eventually sold in the early 90s to some property developer who I think rented it out occasionally." Noah took a sip of the coffee a waitress had silently placed before him. "Were you still living in Maplewood when the teenagers disappeared in 19? "No, we were in Phoenix by then. I read about it in the Maplewood Gazette. Mom still got it delivered, though I never understood why. She would cut out articles and store them in a box, mostly about the lake." "Do you think she was looking for answers about what happened to Timothy?" Michael's expression hardened slightly. "There was nothing to figure out, Mr. Clark. My brother drowned. It was a terrible accident, but not a mystery. He wandered away from supervision, got into deep water, and couldn't make it back to shore. I understand that's the official conclusion. But you think there's some connection between a child's accidental drowning and 3 teenagers who probably ran away together 9 years later, because both happened near the same lake. Michael's voice had risen slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables. Noah chose his next words carefully. I think communities develop complex relationships with places marked by tragedy. Stories evolve, perceptions shift. Sometimes examining those stories can reveal deeper truths about the events themselves. Michael was silent for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in slow circle. Finally, he spoke in a quieter voice. You know what people started saying after those teenagers disappeared? That the lake was cursed, that it had claimed my brother and now it had claimed 3 more. His mouth twisted bitterly, as if a geological formation could have intent or malice. What do you think happened to Ellie, Marcus, and Danny? I have no idea. Probably exactly what everyone thought initially. They ran away together, started new lives somewhere else, without ever contacting their families. For 30 years, Michael shrugged. People do it all the time. Or maybe they had an accident, drove off the road somewhere outside the search perimeter, ended up in a different body of water altogether. The point is, there's no reason to connect their disappearance to my brother's death, other than proximity to the same lake. Noah decided to try a different approach. What can you tell me about your family's history with that cabin? How long had your parents owned it before Timothy's death? It was my grandfather's originally. He built it himself in the 1940s. Dad inherited it when Grandpa died. Was it used often by your family? Every summer weekend. Many weekdays too during vacation. Dad would take us fishing. Mom would swim with us in the shallow cove nearby. A reluctant smile softened Michael's features momentarily. Those are good memories from before. Did anything unusual ever happen at the cabin? Anything that seemed strange or unexplainable? The smile vanished. Like what ghostly apparitions? Strange lights over the water? You sound like those paranormal enthusiasts who used to harass my father after the teenagers disappeared. I'm just trying to understand all aspects of the history, Noah said calmly. Michael sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Look, Mr. Clark, I understand you have a book to write, but my family's tragedy isn't some mystery to be solved or local legend to be exploited. It was real and painful, and we've spent decades trying to move forward from it. I respect that, and I apologize if my questions seem insensitive. That's not my intention. I know. Michael checked his watch. I should get going. My wife is expecting me for dinner. Is there anything else you need to know? Noah hesitated, then decided to ask the question that had been forming in his mind throughout their conversation. Do you still have any of your mother's collected articles about the lake? The ones you mentioned she kept in a box? Michael seemed surprised by the request. Actually, yes. When Mom moved into assisted living last year, I brought a lot of her personal items back to my house. That box is probably in the attic somewhere. Why? I'd be very interested in seeing those articles if you'd be willing to share. They might provide valuable context for my research. After a moment's consideration, Michael nodded. I can look for them. No promises about what's there or when I'll find time to dig them out. But if I come across the box, I'll let you know. They exchanged contact information, and Michael departed, leaving Noah alone with his half-finished coffee and swirling thoughts. The conversation had yielded some useful information, but also raised new questions, particularly about the alleged symbols on Timothy Foster's palm. Had Walter Jenkins been mistaken, or deliberately misleading, or was Michael Foster unaware of, or unwilling to acknowledge this detail from his brother's death? Noah paid for the coffees and stepped outside into the early evening air. The streetlights were just coming on along Main Street, casting pools of yellow light on the sidewalks. Saturday night in Maplewood appeared to be a quiet affair, with just a handful of people visiting the few open establishments, the diner, a bar at the corner, and a small movie theater showing what looked like a second-run film. As Noah walked toward his car, a flyer taped to a lamppost caught his attention. At the top, bold letters proclaimed, Maplewood Lake, Truth Beneath the Surface. Below was an announcement for a meeting of the Maplewood Mystery Study Group, scheduled for tomorrow evening at the community center. The timing seemed too perfect to be coincidence. Noah took a photo of the flyer with his phone, making a mental note to attend the meeting. Whatever this group might be, serious researchers, conspiracy theorists, or something in between, they clearly shared his interest in the lake's mystery. Driving back to the cabin, Noah found himself watching the rearview mirror more than the road ahead, half expecting to see a pale figure in the back seat. But the only presence accompanying him was the weight of accumulated questions, each answer seeming to spawn new uncertainty. The cabin appeared unchanged when he arrived, just an ordinary structure of wood and glass, innocuous in the fading daylight. Yet as Noah approached the front door, key in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being observed. not by human eyes, but by the lake itself, its waters now dark and inscrutable in the gathering dusk. Inside, Noah went straight to his laptop, intent on verifying what Michael had told him. Walter Jenkins had been specific about the symbols on Timothy Foster's palm being mentioned in the coroner's report. Either Walter was mistaken, Michael was unaware of this detail, or one of them was being deliberately untruthful. The county records office wouldn't be open until Monday, but Noah sent an email requesting access to the Foster case file, explaining his research It might not yield immediate results, but it was a start. While he waited for his dinner to heat in the microwave, Noah called Lev. He needed the anchor of her voice, her pragmatic perspective on his increasingly complicated research. "Hey, stranger," she answered on the third ring. "How's the mystery hunt going?" "It's expanding in unexpected directions," Noah replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I spoke with Timothy Foster's brother today. Also found out there's some kind of local mystery study group meeting tomorrow. Sounds like you're making progress. Any more supernatural encounters?" Noah hesitated. Should he tell her about the ripple patterns in the lake, the shifting shadows in the water's reflection, the persistent sense of being watched? It all sounded absurd when he contemplated saying it aloud. "Just the usual tricks of light and imagination," he said finally. "Old houses make strange noises. Isolated locations play with perception." Liv murmured, clearly unconvinced by his casual tone. "Noah, you know you can tell me if something's genuinely bothering you. I won't think you've lost your mind." "I know, it's just..." Noah searched for words that wouldn't make him sound unhinged. "This place has a weight to it. The history. The unanswered questions. Sometimes I feel like I'm being drawn into something larger than the book I came here to write." "That's how all your best work starts," Liv reminded him. "Remember the Bedford Asylum research? You said the same thing then." "This is different," Noah insisted, though he couldn't articulate exactly how. "It feels more personal." A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken concerns. "Noah," Liv said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "just be careful, okay? Not of ghosts or lake monsters, or whatever else, but of getting so caught up in the story that you lose perspective. These disappearances happened 30 years ago, the drowning even earlier. You're writing history, not living it." "I know," Noah said, though a part of him wondered if that distinction was as clear as it should be. "I'm being careful, promise." They talked a while longer about Lev's upcoming exhibition, the weather in Chicago versus Maplewood, ordinary topics that helped ground Noah in the present. By the time they said goodnight, he felt more balanced. The strange experiences of the past 24 hours relegated to the category of interesting anecdotes rather than unsettling omens. Noah ate his dinner at the kitchen table, reviewing his notes and planning the next day's activity. The mystery study group meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., which left the day free for further research. He considered returning to the Eastern Shore nature area for a more thorough exploration, perhaps searching for any signs of the carvings mentioned in the newspaper article. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Outside, a nearly full moon had risen, casting silver light across the lake. Noah found himself drawn to the window, gazing out at the illuminated landscape. The water appeared almost luminous in the moonlight, a vast mirror reflecting the night sky. As Noah watched, a thin mist began to form over the surface, swirling in graceful patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their movement. A memory surfaced, unbidden himself as a small child, standing at a similar window, watching similar mist dance across the lake's surface. In the memory, he was not alone. Someone stood beside him, a presence both familiar and forgotten, watching with him as the mist took shape. "Remember," whispered a voice from the depths of that memory. "You have to remember." Noah jerked away from the window, the glass suddenly cold against his fingertip. That phrase again, the same words that had echoed in his mind during his strange experience the previous night, the same message that had drawn 3 teenagers to the lake 30 years ago. What was he supposed to remember, and why did it matter now? After all these, Noah returned to the table, forcing his attention back to his notes. Research was his anchor, facts his compass. Whatever strange undercurrents might run through Maplewood and its lake, he would navigate them methodically, one verifiable piece of information at a time. Yet as Noah worked late into the night, organizing his findings and preparing questions for the mystery study group, he couldn't escape the sensation that the cabin itself was watching him, waiting to see what he would remember, and what would remember him in return.
The community center was packed for the Maplewood Mystery Study Group meeting. Noah found a seat in the back row, Observing the eclectic gathering of locals, some appeared to be serious researchers with notebooks and carefully organized files. Others had the eager expressions of conspiracy enthusiasts. At the front of the room, a gray-haired woman arranged materials on a folding table. "That's son Matheson," whispered the elderly man seated beside Noah. She founded the group after her niece disappeared in night. Noah glanced at him with sudden interest. Her niece was one of the 3 teenagers. The man nodded. "The Danny Reeves. Helen's been looking for answers and..." Before Noah could ask more questions, Helen called the meeting to order. She welcomed newcomers, nodding politely toward Noah, and began reviewing recent findings. The group had been methodically documenting anomalous events around Maplewood Lake. Unexplained lights, strange sound phenomena, unusual wildlife behavior. Some members had been mapping these occurrences, looking for patterns. The eastern shore continues to be a hotspot, Helen explained, pointing to a large map pinned to the wall. Red dots clustered heavily around the area where Noah's cabin stood, particularly during the spring equinox and summer solstice. Noah listened with growing fascination as members shared their experiences and theories. Some were easily dismissed as overactive imaginations, but others, particularly those involving unusual reflection phenomena in the lake, echoed his own recent experience. When the formal presentation ended and the meeting broke into smaller discussion groups, Noah approached Helen. "Ms. Matheson, I'm Noah Clark. I'm researching the 1994 disappearances for a book." Helen studied him carefully, another writer looking for a sensational story. "No," Noah said firmly. "I'm interested in understanding what actually happened, not just to Ellie, Marcus, and Danny, but how their disappearance connects to Timothy Foster's drowning and the broader history of the lake." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Helen's expression softened slightly. "What do you know about the symbols?" "Only that they were found carved into trees near the Foster cabin the night the teenagers disappeared, and that Timothy Foster may have had similar markings on his palm when he drowned." Helen's eyes widened. "May have. It's documented in the coroner's report." Michael Foster claims there was no mention of symbols in the report. Michael would say that, Helen replied, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "The Foster family has always tried to distance themselves from anything that might suggest Timothy's drowning was more than a simple accident." Noah hesitated, then decided to share his own experience. "I'm staying at the Foster cabin. 2 nights ago during the storm, I saw something, what appeared to be the figure of a boy outside my window. He had symbols drawn on his palm." Instead of the skepticism Noah expected, Helen nodded as if this confirmed something she already knew. "He's trying to communicate. Who is Timothy, or whatever remains of him in this world." Helen lowered her voice. "Miss Clark, what do you know about the history of Maplewood Lake before white settlement?" "Very little. Just that there was an Ojibwe settlement on the eastern shore in the early 1800s. The lake was sacred to them, not just a resource, but a living entity. They believed it existed in 2 worlds simultaneously, our physical world and the spirit world. Certain locations around the shore, particularly on the eastern side, were considered thin places where the boundary between worlds could be crossed under specific conditions." Noah thought of the strange ripple patterns he'd observed, the shifting shadows visible only in reflection. "You believe this is more than folklore?" "I believe my niece and her friends discovered something at that lake, something connected to what Timothy Foster encountered 9 years early." Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn journal. "This was Danny's. The police returned it to me after the investigation stalled. They dismissed it as teenage nonsense, but I think it holds the key to understanding what happened." She handed it to Noah, who accepted it with surprise. "Are you sure you want to share this? I've waited 30 years for answers, Mr. Clark. If you can help uncover the truth, then yes, I want to share it." Noah carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, with occasional doodles in the margins. The early entries were typical teenage concerns: school, friends, family conflicts. But around March 1994, 3 months before the disappearance, the tone changed. "Had the dream again last night. The lake was calling. The water wasn't water but a doorway. The symbols showed the way through. Subsequent entries described increasingly detailed dreams, shared between Danny, Ellie, and Marcus, all featuring the lake, mysterious symbols, and a presence in the water that was trying to communicate with them. March 29, Ellie remembered something today. When we were kids at the summer splash where that boy drowned, we weren't just building a sand castle. We were drawing the symbols in the sand. He saw them. He followed them into the water. We made him go there. Noah looked up, his breath catching. They believed they were responsible for Timothy Foster's drowning. Helen nodded grimly. They were 8 years old, drawing patterns in the sand that they didn't understand. Patterns that came to them in dreams. Timothy saw those patterns and was drawn to them. But why would the patterns lead him into dangerous water? The symbols aren't just drawings. They're a language, a way of communicating with whatever exists in the lake. But like any language, intent matters, and children don't always understand the power of what they're invoking. Noah continued reading. The final entries became increasingly urgent, describing how the 3 teenagers had been researching local history, ancient symbols, and shamanic practices. They had come to believe they needed to return to the lake to fix what they had broken, and close the door they had accidentally opened. The final entry, dated June 15, 1994, the day before they disappeared, was brief but chilling. We know what we have to do now. The lake has been patient. It's waited 9 years for us to return and complete the crossing. Tomorrow night, under the full moon, we'll go to the Foster cabin and follow the symbols to where they lead. If we've interpreted them correctly, we can restore balance. If not, the entry ended there. Unfit. Noah closed the journal, his mind racing. You think they deliberately went into the lake, following these symbols? I think they believed they could cross between worlds and return, that they could somehow make amends for Timothy's death. They didn't understand that the crossing points work differently, depending on the cycle of the moon and the position of the stars. Helen's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. They crossed over but couldn't find their way back. That's why no bodies were ever found, Noah murmured. The lake doesn't give up what truly belongs to it. Helen took back the journal. There's more. After they disappeared, I began having the dreams too. The symbols, the voice from the water. I think they're still there in some form. Not dead, but not fully alive either. Caught between worlds. The meeting was ending around them. People gathering their belongings and filtering out of the room. Noah remained seated, trying to process everything he'd learned. Matheson, I understand this is difficult to ask, but do you have copies of the symbols, from Danny's journal or elsewhere? Helen hesitated, then nodded. I'll send you some scans, but be careful, Mr. Clark. Looking too deeply into these matters can draw attention from the other side. You mean the lake itself? Whatever exists within it, whatever has existed there since before humans settled here. Helen stood to leave. One more thing you should know. You're not just a random writer who happened to choose this subject. You were drawn here, like the other. What do you mean? Your name. It was in Danny's journal too, in one of her last entries. Noah will remember, it said. When he returns, he'll understand what we did. Noah felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. That's impossible. I was 6 years old when I left Maplewood. I never knew these teenagers. And yet here you are, 30 years later, staying in the same cabin where they disappeared, asking the same questions they did. Helen's gaze was penetrating. You lived here during the summer Timothy Foster drowned, didn't? Yes, but were you at the summer splash event that day? Noah started to deny it, then stopped. Had he been there? His memories of that time were so fragmented. I'm not sure. Remember, Noah, Helen said softly. You have to remember. The phrase sent a shock through his system. The same words from his dream, from the apparition of the drowned boy, now spoken by this woman, who somehow knew his connection to events he couldn't fully recall. Noah left the meeting in a daze, Helen's contact information in his phone, and a promise to share anything he discovered. The drive back to the cabin was a blur, his mind struggling to fit these new pieces into the puzzle. Had he really been present when Timothy Foster drowned? Had he known Ellie, Marcus, and Danny as a child? Why couldn't he remember? At the cabin, Noah immediately called. He needed her level-headed perspective now more than ever. Noah, she answered, concern evident in her voice. It's after midnight. Is everything okay? I'm not sure, he admitted. I've learned some things that are difficult to explain. He told her about the meeting, The journal Helen's claimed that his name appeared in Danny's writings, leaving out the more supernatural elements to avoid sounding unhinged. That's disturbing, Liv said when he finished. But there must be a rational explanation. Clark isn't an uncommon name. Maybe it was a different Noah. Maybe. But the coincidences are piling up, Liv. I feel like I'm missing something important. Something from my own past here. Have you called your mother? She might remember details from when you lived there. Noah hesitated. His relationship with his mother was complicated at best. They spoke infrequently, and he deliberately not told her about this project, knowing she'd disapprove of him returning to Maplewood. I'll try her tomorrow, he said, not entirely convinced he would. I should probably get some sleep now. Please be careful, Noah. This whole situation feels, I don't know. Just take care of yourself, okay? After they said goodnight, Noah sat at the dining table, surrounded by his research materials. He added notes from the meeting, trying to organize the connection between the symbols, Timothy's drowning, and the teenager's disappearance was becoming clearer, but his own role in the story remained obscure. Around 2 a.m., exhaustion finally overcame curiosity. Noah headed to bed, leaving his materials spread across the table. As he drifted towards sleep, the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore seemed to form a pattern, like language, like music, like a voice calling his name from a great distance. Noah dreamed. He was a child again, 6 years old, building a sand castle at the summer splash. But he wasn't alone. 3 other children worked beside him. Ellie, Marcus, and Danny, though somehow he knew their names without being told. Together they weren't just building a castle but drawing elaborate patterns in the sand. What are these? Asked a boy's voice behind them. Noah turned to see Timothy Foster standing there, curious eyes fixed on their creation. They're magic symbols, Ellie told him importantly. They show the way to the mermaid kingdom under the lake. Can I see? Timothy asked, crouching beside them. You have to draw them on your hand first, Marcus instructed, holding out a blue marker. That's how they know you're allowed to enter. Timothy took the marker and carefully copied one of the symbols onto his palm. Like this? Perfect, Danny said. Now you have to go to the special place and show it to the water. Where's the special place? The 4 children pointed toward the distant eastern shore. Over there, where the big rocks are. That's where the doorway is. Timothy studied his palm, fascinated by the blue marking. Will I really see mermaids? You'll see something amazing, Noah heard his younger self promise. Something nobody else can see. The dream shifted. Now Noah was watching from the shore as Timothy waded into the water near the eastern rocks, his marked palm extended toward the surface. The boy looked back once, waving excitedly to someone. A distracted father, turning too late to see his son venture into deeper water. Then Timothy was gone, slipping beneath the surface without a sound, drawn downward by something that had recognized the symbol on his palm as an invitation. The scene changed again. Now Noah was in his childhood bedroom, crying as his parents argued in the next room. He was there, Rebecca, with those other children. They admit they were playing with the foster boy just before he drowned. He's 6 years old, James. He didn't cause that boy's death. I'm not saying he did, but something happened out there. Something the kids aren't telling. And I don't want our son questioned by police, or traumatized by this whole town's morbid fascination with the drowning. So we just leave, abandon our home. We sell the house. I request a transfer with the company. We start fresh somewhere Noah can forget this ever happened. And if he remembers someday, why would he? Children his age don't retain these kinds of memories, especially if we never speak of it again. It's for his own good, Rebecca. Trust me. The dream dissolved into swirling darkness, and Noah found himself standing on the shore of Maplewood Lake. As an adult, before him stood 4 children, his younger self, Ellie, Marcus, and Danny. Behind them, partially submerged in the water, was the translucent figure of Timothy Foster. You came back, his younger self said. You remembered. Not everything, Noah answered. Not yet. You have to, Ellie insisted. Only you can fix it now. Fix what? What we broke, Marcus said. What we all broke together. The door, Danny added. We opened it without understanding. We can't close it from this side anymore. Noah looked at Timothy's ghostly form. I'm sorry, we didn't know what we were doing. The drowned boy's expression was neither angry nor sad, but expect. He raised his hand, showing the blue symbol on his palm, the same one Noah had glimpsed through his window during the storm. The symbols are a key, Timothy said, his voice echoing as if from a great distance. They can open or close the way between worlds. But the alignment must be right, and the intent must be pure. I don't understand, Noah said. What am I supposed to do? Remember, the 5 children said in unison. Then return to the water with the key. Noah awoke with a gasp, the dream vivid in his mind. Outside, dawn was breaking over the lake, bathing the water in pale golden light. He sat up, heart pounding, fragments of memory surfacing like debris after a storm. He had been there. He had been part of the group of children playing with Timothy Foster just before the drowning. And somehow, in ways his 6-year-old mind couldn't comprehend, they had inadvertently sent the boy to his death by sharing symbols they themselves had seen only in dreams. Noah reached for his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, called his mother. Despite the early hour, she answered on the 3rd ring. Noah, is everything all right? Mom, I need to ask you something important. He took a deep breath. When we lived in Maplewood, was I at the summer splash event where Timothy Foster drowned? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mom, please tell me the truth. How do you know about that? Her voice was strained. You never remembered before. I'm in Maplewood, Mom, staying at the old Foster cabin on the eastern shore. What? Noah, why would you go back there? After everything we did to make me forget. Noah finished for her. It didn't work. Not completely. I'm remembering now, but I need to know everything. I was friends with them, wasn't I? Ellie Chambers, Marcus Holt, Danny Reeves. Another painful silence. You were all in the same kindergarten class. The 5 of you, including Timothy, were inseparable that summer. Why didn't you ever tell me? Even as an adult, your father and I agreed it was best forgotten. You were so young, and after the drowning, you had nightmares, talked about the lake calling to you. The child psychologist said it was a trauma response, that creating distance would help you heal. Her voice broke slightly. We thought we were protecting you. Noah closed his eyes, absorbing this revelation. What happened after we left? Did you keep in touch with any of the families? No. Your father was adamant about making a clean break. She paused. I saw in the papers when those other children disappeared years later. I wanted to reach out to their families, but your father, he was afraid it would somehow drag you back into it all, that someone might remember you were part of that group and start asking questions we couldn't answer. What questions, Mom? What were you afraid I might say? Noah, you were a child with an active imagination. You said things about the lake, about symbols that came in dreams, about a door under the water. The police dismissed it as fantasy, but the way you described it, it frightened us. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture Noah wasn't sure he wanted to see. Mom, I need to go now, but thank you for finally telling me the truth. Noah, please, come home. Whatever you think you're doing there, it's not worth reopening old wounds. I'll call you soon, he promised, ending the call before she could protest further. Noah spent the morning reviewing his notes with new clarity, understanding connections that had previously eluded him. The symbols in Walter's photographs, in Sophia Leonard's paintings, in Danny's journal, they were the same ones from his childhood dreams, the same ones he and his friends had drawn in the sand that fateful day. At noon, an email arrived from Helen Matheson, containing scans of pages from Danny's journal, including drawings of the symbols and notes on their meanings, as the teenagers had understood them. One passage stood out. The symbols are like addresses. They specify which doorway and which destination. What we didn't understand as children is that they work both ways. Something can come through, or someone can go through. Timothy went through. We need to go through too, to bring him back. But we need Noah. He was always the strongest dream. Noah stared at the words, a chill running through him despite the warm spring sunlight streaming through the windows. The teenagers had been planning to rescue Timothy, to somehow cross into whatever realm had claimed him and bring him back. And they had been waiting for Noah to return and help them. But Noah had never returned. His parents had made sure of that. And so 9 years after Timothy's drowning, the 3 teenagers had attempted the crossing without him. Without the strongest dreamer to guide them, they had become lost between worlds, neither fully here nor fully gone. Like Timothy himself, the realization was overwhelming. Noah stepped outside, needing fresh air, and the solid reality of Earth beneath his feet. The lake stretched before him, serene and innocent in the midday sun. Hard to believe it contained doorways to other realms, that it had swallowed 4 young lives over the years. As Noah stood contemplating the water, his phone buzzed with a text from Michael Foster. Found Mom's box of articles. There's more than news clippings, old photos, journals, some strange drawings. You should see these. Can you come by around 3? Noah texted back an immediate affirmative. This was another piece of the puzzle, perhaps the final one. He needed to understand what had really happened and what, if anything, he could do about it now. When Noah arrived at Michael's home, a well-maintained colonial on a quiet street away from the lake, he found the man more subdued than during their previous meeting. Thanks for coming, Michael said, leading Noah to a study where a cardboard box sat open on a desk. I've been going through these materials since last night. I'm not sure what to make of that. The box contained exactly what Michael had described. Newspaper clippings about both Timothy's drowning and the teenager's disappearance, photographs of the Foster family at the lake cabin, several journals belonging to Diane Foster, and a folder containing drawings of the now familiar symbol carefully rendered in blue ink. My mother was documenting these for years, Michael said, showing Noah a journal entry from 1986, a year after Timothy's death. She claimed they came to her in dreams, that Timothy was trying to communicate through them. Noah nodded, examining the drawing. And you never knew about this? She kept it hidden from us, from everyone apparently. Michael rubbed his face wearily. After seeing all this, I'm not even sure what I believe anymore. Mom wasn't mentally ill or prone to fantasies. She was rational, practical. For her to compile all this, to believe so strongly in these connections, there must have been something to it. There was, Noah said quietly. He explained what he had learned, his own childhood presence at the lake that day, the shared dreams that had brought the symbols to the children, the teenagers' belief that they could somehow rescue Timothy. Michael listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to troubled consideration. So you're saying my brother isn't really dead? That he's, what? Trapped in some other dimension accessible through the lake? I don't know exactly, Noah admitted, but I believe something happened that day that can't be explained by conventional understanding. And I believe Ellie, Marcus, and Danny discovered part of the truth and tried to act on it. And they're trapped too now. Noah nodded. According to what I've learned, they attempted to cross over without fully understanding how to return. They've been there for 30 years, along with Timothy. Michael was silent for a long moment, processing this information. Finally he said, what happens? What are you going to do with all this? It was the question Noah had been asking himself all day. What was his responsibility to these lost souls from his past? Could he simply write their story and leave? Or was he meant to do something more? I think I'm supposed to finish what they started, Noah said slowly. They believed I was the strongest dreamer, that I had some ability to navigate between worlds through the symbols. They were waiting for me to return and help them. After 30 years, even if any of this is real, and I'm not saying I believe it, what makes you think you can succeed where they failed? Because now I have the complete picture, between Danny's journal, your mother's records, and my own recovered memories. I understand how the symbols work together. And tonight is the spring equinox, one of the times when the boundary between worlds is thinnest, according to multiple sources. Michael shook his head. This is insane. You're talking about risking your life based on dreams, and 30-year-old scribblings from teenagers and my grieving mother. I know how it sounds, Noah acknowledged, but I've felt the lake calling since I arrived. I've seen Timothy's spirit. The connection is real, Michael. And what if you're wrong? What if you drown yourself chasing ghosts? Noah had no answer for that. The risk was undeniable, but the alternative, walking away from this second chance to help his childhood friends, seemed unthinkable now that he understood his connection to their fate. At least, let me come with you, Michael said, unexpectedly. If you're determined to do this, whatever it, you shouldn't be alone. Noah considered the offer. Having someone else present was safer from a practical standpoint, but the crossing itself, if he could achieve it, would be a solitary journey. Come to the cabin at sunset, Noah decided, but stay on shore. If I'm not back by midnight, call for help. Michael nodded grimly. I still think this is madness, but it's Timmy we're talking about, if there's even a chance. They spent the next hour reviewing all the materials, with Noah making careful notes of symbol sequences and their purported meaning. According to Diane Foster's journals, The symbols needed to be drawn in a specific order to create a map between worlds. The intent of the traveler was crucial. Crossing with the purpose of retrieval required a different sequence than crossing for exploration or escape. By the time Noah left Michael's house, the sun was already lowering toward the western horizon. He drove to the cabin, his mind focused on the task ahead. The fear was there. Certainly fear of drowning, fear of being trapped between worlds, fear of failure. But stronger than fear was a sense of rightness, of completing a circle that had been left open for 30 years. At the cabin, Noah gathered what he would need: a waterproof flashlight, the copied symbol sequences, a blue mark. He changed into swimming shorts and a t-shirt, then sat at the kitchen table to wait for Michael in the falling darkness. Sunset painted the lake in shades of orange and purple, the water perfectly still in the windless evening. Noah stood on the deck, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue above. When Michael's car pulled up beside the cabin, the twilight had faded to dusk. "I still think we should call someone," Michael said as he approached. "The police, a rescue team, someone." "And tell them what?" Noah asked. "That we're going to attempt an interdimensional rescue based on symbols from dreams. They'd stop us before we started." Michael couldn't argue with that logic. Instead, he asked what exactly is supposed to happen. "How does this crossing work?" "According to everything I've learned, I need to draw the symbol sequence on my body, then enter the lake at the specific location where the boundary is thinnest. If my understanding and intent are correct, the water itself becomes a passage rather than a barrier. And if your understanding is wrong," Noah smiled thinly, "then I get wet, give up and go home." "I'm not planning to drown myself, Michael." They walked together to the shore as true darkness settled over the lake. The nearly full moon provided ample light, its reflection creating a silver pathway across the water's surface. Using the blue marker, Noah carefully drew the symbols on his palms, arms and chest, following the sequence described in Diane Foster's journal. "For one traveling with the intent to retrieve lost souls, this is it," Noah said once the preparations were complete. "Remember, if I'm not back by midnight, call for help. But not before then." Michael nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "Good luck, and thank you for trying." Noah waded into the lake, the cool water rising around his calves. Then the sensation was ordinary, exactly what one would expect from a lake in early spring. But as he moved deeper, past waist height toward chest depth, the water seemed to thicken, to embrace him with unexpected warmth. When he reached the spot marked in Diane's drawings, a point where underwater rocks formed a natural circle, Noah took a deep breath, raised his symbol-marked palms toward the moon, and spoke the words written in Donnie's journal. "I come with purpose, to find what was lost. I come with love, to heal what was broken. I come with memory, to restore what was forgotten." For a moment, nothing happened. Noah stood chest deep in ordinary lake water, feeling foolish despite his conviction. Then the surface around him began to glow with a soft blue light, the same color as the markings on his skin, as if the symbols themselves were being reflected and amplified by the water. The light spread outward in rippling circles, creating patterns that matched the symbols he had drawn. Noah felt a gentle tugging, not downward but somehow inward, as if the lake were folding around him, drawing him into itself rather than beneath its surface. He heard Michael call his name from the shore, but the sound was distorted, stretching and fading like a recording played at decreasing speed. The water rose to Noah's neck, yet he felt no pressure, no need to hold his breath. The moonlight above fragmented into prisms, then vanished entirely as the lake closed over his head, and Noah was elsewhere. He stood on what appeared to be a shoreline, but everything was inverted. Water formed the sky above, rippling with moonlight from an unseen source. The ground beneath his feet was solid but had the visual texture of sand, seen through clear water. Around him, ghostly trees swayed without wind, their forms translucent and fluid. "Noah?" He turned to find 4 figures watching him, 3 teenagers and a younger boy. They appeared substantial but with a quality of light emanating from within them, their edges slightly blurred as if viewed through moving water. Ellie, Marcus, Danny, Noah recognized them from the photographs he had studied. And Timothy, the boy stepped forward, smiling. "You remember, you came back." "I'm sorry it took so long," Noah said. "I didn't know. My parents took me away, made me forget. We knew you'd return eventually," Ellie said. "The lake keeps its promises. We've been waiting 30 years, Noah whispered. "You've been here for 30. Time moves differently here," Marcus explained. "It doesn't feel that long to us."
But we can't go back on our own. Danny added, we need you to guide us. You were always the strongest dreamer. Noah looked around at the strange inverted landscape. How do we get back? I'm not sure I understand this place well enough to find the way. You don't need to understand it, Timothy said. You just need to remember the way you came, and reverse it. Noah raised his palms, studying the symbols that still glowed blue against his skin. Reverse the sequence. The four nodded in unison. It's not that simple though, Ellie warned. The doorway on this side isn't stable. The five of us need to pass through together or it might close before everyone makes it. And there's something else, Marcus said hesitant. Something that doesn't want us to leave. As if summoned by his words, the inverted water sky above them darkened, swirling into a vortex centered directly overhead. A presence made itself felt. Ancient, powerful, possessed. It had no definable form, but Noah sensed it watching them, evaluating their intentions. What is that? He asked, his voice hushed. The Guardian, Danny answered. It protects the boundary between worlds. It let us cross because we carried the symbols as invitations, but it never intended to let us return. It keeps us here because we interest it, Timothy explained. It's been alone for so long, watching your world through the water. We're like pets, or specimens, things to study. The vortex tightened, descending toward them like a funnel cloud made of dark water. Noah felt its attention focus on him, the newcomer, the potential threat to its collection of captured souls. We need to go now, Noah urged. Together, before it realizes what we're doing. He took Timothy's hand, then Ellie's, forming a chain with all five of them linked together. With his free hand, Noah traced the reversed symbol sequence in the air before them, his finger leaving trails of blue light that hung suspended like neon in the strange atmosphere. The completed sequence formed a doorway of glowing blue, a rectangular portal, showing glimpses of the normal lake, the moonlit night, the waiting shore where Michael stood watching. That's it, Noah said. We move together all at once. Don't let go of each other's hand. They stepped toward the portal as one unit, but as they approached, the presence above them seemed to recognize their intent. The vortex plunged downward, surrounding them with churning darkness. Noah felt a pressure against his mind. Not pain exactly, but an overwhelming sense of violation, as if something were sifting through his thoughts and memories, looking for a way to stop them. Stay, belong to me. I have kept you safe. I have kept you together. The other world brings only pain and separation. The voice wasn't audible but felt, resonating through Noah's body like the vibration of a massive bell. He sensed the others experiencing it too, their steps faltering as the presence intensified its efforts to hold them. Don't listen, Noah shouted over the psychic din. It's lying. We don't belong here. With a final surge of effort, Noah pulled the chain of linked hands through the portal. There was resistance, a sensation like moving through thick gel, and then cold, moonlight, air in his lungs. Noah broke the surface of Maplewood Lake, gasping. Around him, four other heads emerged from the water, all solid, all real, all alive. They had made it back. Michael was shouting from the shore, wading into the shallows to help. Noah guided the others toward him, keeping their chain intact, until all five stood on solid ground, dripping and shivering, but undeniably present in the physical world. Impossible, Michael whispered, staring at his brother, no longer a 10-year-old boy but a 9-year-old, as if only a year had passed for him in the other realm. Timothy looked around in wonder, his eyes wide as he took in the familiar shoreline, the cabin, his adult brother. Mike, you got so big. The three teenagers seemed similarly disoriented, their expressions flickering between joy at their return and confusion at the changed world they now faced. They appeared exactly as they had in 1994, untouched by the 30 years that had elapsed. We need to get everyone warm, Noah said, breaking the moment of stunned reunion. Inside the cabin, the next hours passed in a blur of explanations, phone calls, tears and laughter. Michael called his mother first, barely able to form coherent sentences as he told her that Timothy had returned. Then came calls to the other families, the Chambers, the Holts, the Reeves, all now scattered across the country but bound by the shared tragedy of 3 decades past.
By dawn, the cabin was filled with local police, paramedics, and bewildered officials trying to make sense of what appeared impossible. Noah watched from the deck as the reunions unfolded, Helen Matheson collapsing to her knees as she embraced her niece Danny, the Chambers and Holt families arriving in a flurry of disbelief and joy, Diane Foster holding Timothy in a crushing embrace, tears streaming down her face. The official explanation took shape quickly. A case of mistaken identification. The teenagers hadn't drowned, but had been living off the grid for reasons that would remain under investigation. Timothy's case was more complicated. A child missing for 30 years suddenly returned. But in the chaos and miracle of the moment, the authorities seemed content to process the paperwork and ask questions later. No one knew the truth would never appear in any official report. How could it? A lake that existed in two worlds. Ancient symbols that opened doorways. Children preserved in an ageless realm for decades. These weren't facts that could be documented in police statements or medical records. As the morning progressed, Noah found himself sitting alone on the dock, watching the now innocent lake sparkle in the spring sunshine. He felt oddly hollow, as if the completion of his mission had left an emptiness where purpose had been. "You look lost," said a voice behind him. Noah turned to see Ellie approaching, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. "Just processing," he replied as she sat beside him. "It's a lot to take in. Tell me about it," she said with a faint smile. "According to everyone, I'm supposed to be 47 years old." Noah nodded, studying her teenage face, unchanged from the photographs in his research files. "What was it like on the other side?" Ellie looked out across the water. "Like a dream you can't quite wake up from. Time felt stretched. We knew we were missing something, but we couldn't remember what it was." She turned to him. "Without you, we couldn't find the way back. The symbols needed all 5 of us to work properly. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you tried to cross in '94. You were a child. Your parents protected you the only way they knew how." She hesitated, then added, "But I'm glad you remembered eventually, that you came back for us." "What happens now?" Noah asked. "For all of you, I don't know," Ellie admitted. "How do you rejoin a world that's moved on without you? Our families have aged. Our friends have built lives we know nothing about." She glanced back at the cabin where the others were still talking with officials. "Timothy has the easiest adjustment in some ways. He's still a child. The rest of us, we're teenagers with 1990s educations. We don't even know how to use your phones." "You'll adapt," Noah said. "Humans are good at that." "What about you? Will you still write your book?" Noah considered the question. "A different version, maybe. One that respects your privacy and the mysteries that should remain mystery." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a heron stalk fish in the shallows nearby. Finally, Ellie spoke again. "The Guardian is still there, you know. Still watching through the water." Noah felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "Do you think it will try to take you back?" "No," she said with surprising certainty. "It understood something at the end. Something about belonging and choice. I think that's why it finally let us go." She looked down at her palm where the faintest trace of a blue symbol was still visible. "But the doorway remained. The lake will always be a thin place between worlds. Should I be worried about staying in the cabin?" Ellie smiled. "The Guardian isn't evil, Noah. Just old and lonely. It wanted companions who could understand its world." She stood, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "I think we should go back inside. They'll have more questions for all of us." As Noah followed her toward the cabin, his phone buzzed with a message from Liv. Local news reporting 4 missing persons from the 80s-90s found alive near Maplewood Lake. "Tell me that's not connected to whatever you've been investigating." Noah smiled, typing back. "It's a long story, one I'll need to tell you in person. Coming home tomorrow." He paused at the cabin door, looking back at the lake one last time. In the clear morning light, it was just water. Beautiful, ordinary water. But Noah knew better now. He understood what had always lived beneath the surface, what had called to him in dreams since childhood. Some doors once opened could never be fully closed again. Some memories once recovered remained part of you forever. And some mysteries, even when solved, only deepened with understanding. Inside the cabin, the returned travelers were beginning the long process of reintegration into a world that had continued without them. There would be challenges ahead: medical examinations, psychological evaluations, legal complications, the unavoidable media attention. But they were alive, they were home, and they were together. Noah took one last picture of the lake from the doorway, then joined the other. His book would need a new ending now. Not about disappearances and drownings, but about returns and recoveries, about the power of memory and the strange ways lives could intersect across time and world. The last chapter would be about what truly lay beneath the surface of Maplewood Lake. Not just water and ancient secrets, but connections that ran deeper than anyone could see. Threads of shared experience that once woven together could never truly be broken. As Noah closed the cabin door behind him, he thought he heard a whisper from the direction of the water. Not threatening but acknowledging, a reminder that some stories never really ended. They just entered new chapter. And for the first time since arriving in Maplewood, he felt completely at peace with that truth. The end.